If you Google the most incredible story of all time, this story pops up all over the internet. When you read through it, you will completely understand why. Let us go straight to Muskegon, Michigan in the early 1940s. A young man named Joseph Byerly was living a normal, ordinary life. He was a great athlete and a senior at his high school. He was so talented that he actually earned a full scholarship to attend Notre Dame University. He had a bright future, and his parents were very proud. But then, in December of 1941, everything changed. The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and the United States entered World War II. When Joseph graduated in 1942, he had a massive decision to make. He had this amazing college opportunity, but he just could not bring himself to go. He saw all the other young men his age going off to fight, and he realized he could not sit in a safe classroom while others were risking their lives. So, he turned down his scholarship and enlisted in the Army. He immediately volunteered for one of the most dangerous units in the entire Army, the parachute infantry. To become a paratrooper, Joseph had to survive a training regimen that was absolute hell. The instructors pushed these young men to their absolute physical limits every single day. Joseph spent hours doing physical training in blistering, humid heat that made it hard to breathe. They went on exhausting forced marches that lasted for miles and miles, carrying heavy backpacks. They had to run up steep mountains carrying their full combat gear, with their heavy boots pounding against the dirt until their lungs burned and their legs felt like lead. By 1943, Joseph was fully trained and stationed in England, desperate to put his training to the test. But the massive Allied invasion of occupied France was still several months away. Joseph did not want to wait around in a barracks doing nothing. So, when the military started looking for volunteers for an incredibly dangerous and highly classified mission, he stepped forward immediately. This mission was run by the OSS, which was the predecessor to the modern CIA. The OSS officers sat the volunteers down and explained that they would be parachuting in the middle of the night, completely alone, into Nazi-occupied France. Each volunteer would carry a heavy backpack loaded with solid gold bars. Once they hit the ground, they had to find the French resistance and hand the gold over so they could fund their operations. The resistance would try their best to protect them and smuggle them back to England, but there were absolutely no guarantees. The OSS officers made it very clear that if they were caught, they would be brutally tortured and executed as spies. But Joseph did not hesitate. He boarded the plane in the dark, jumped out into the night, and successfully completed the mission. He managed to deliver the gold and get back to England safely. He liked the rush of the mission so much that when they asked for volunteers again shortly after, he signed up and completed a second successful jump. Shortly after his second mission, word came down that the D-Day invasion was set to take place on June 6th. Joseph's unit was told they would be parachuting into France the night before to destroy bridges, cut power supply lines, and soften up the defenses before the main invasion force hit Utah Beach just a couple of hours later. So, in the dead of night on June 5th, Joseph and his unit were flying over France when their transport plane was suddenly struck by heavy enemy fire. As their plane was literally falling to the ground in flames, Joseph leaped out of the door into the dark sky. But the problem was, he was only 400 feet off the ground, which is extremely low for a jump. His parachute inflated just in time, and he managed to survive the fall, but he landed right on top of a stone church where a German sniper was positioned in the steeple. The sniper spotted him on the roof and began taking shots, forcing Joseph to dodge the bullets before slipping off the roof and running out of sight. Once on the ground, Joseph was completely alone with no idea where the rest of his unit was. He loaded his M1 carbine and began an incredible one-man mission. He ran from the church under sniper fire and eventually made it to the town's power substation, which he blew up with thermite to cut the power to the entire town. From there, he went building to building, fighting every German soldier he came across, including an entire squad of German infantry that he ambushed with hand grenades. At some point, Joseph made his way over to one of the bridges leading into this town that, if he blew up, would prevent the Germans from sending reinforcements to Utah Beach. But as he crawled through one of the thick hedgerows near the bridge, he fell headfirst into a German machine gun nest. When he turned around, there were multiple machine guns pointed right at his face. He had no choice but to raise his hands and surrender. The Germans marched Joseph to a POW holding area, but as soon as he got there, massive explosions ripped through the camp. It was not clear if it was German artillery or American aircraft, but shells were killing both guards and prisoners. A piece of shrapnel tore into Joseph's leg, blowing him into a ditch. Despite being in agonizing pain, he took this as an opportunity to escape. He got up and ran as best as he could, remaining uncaught for 12 hours before he was caught again. This time, they locked him in the back of a covered truck to send him to St. Lo. But on the way, an Allied aircraft strafed the vehicle. Joseph survived the attack and was able to leap out of a hole in the side of the truck. He attempted to escape, but was caught again. The Germans got him to St. Lo, and that night, the Americans launched an all-night bombing campaign. Joseph narrowly survived, which is a recurring theme in his story because he was repeatedly almost killed by his own teammate. For the next few days, German officers interrogated Joseph 20 to 24 hours a day. He did not give them any information, repeatedly calling them names until they got so fed up they just beat him unconscious. He was kept in a hospital for several days to recover. For the next 3 months, Joseph was starved, beaten, and moved to multiple camps, forced to do back-breaking labor all day while weathering hunger, disease, and exhaustion. At one point, he was locked inside a crowded boxcar with 50 other men. The train was strafed by Allied planes, and Joseph was one of the very few people to survive. In September of 1944, Joseph was moved to a prison camp in Poland that held 12,000 Russian prisoners. As soon as he got there, he immediately began planning his next escape. 2 months later, on a freezing night in November, Joseph, along with 3 other American prisoners, managed to cut the barbed wire, snuck out of the camp, and began making their escape south. They snuck into a nearby railway station and hopped on a train car they believed was headed deeper into Poland. Their plan was to meet up with the Soviet Red Army as it pushed through the region. But unfortunately, they got on the wrong train, and they wound up in Berlin, the capital of Nazi Germany. Now, one thing you do not hear much about when it comes to World War II is there was actually a large number of Germans who hated Hitler and totally disagreed with the Nazis. They had organized a secret German underground resistance designed to help the Allies during the war. So, when Joseph and the other 3 American prisoners arrived in Berlin, still wearing their prisoner uniforms, a member of the German resistance saw them and immediately grabbed them, bringing them into hiding. But after only a week, the infamous Nazi secret police, also known as the Gestapo, discovered them and arrested them. Over the next few days, Joseph and the other American prisoners got to see firsthand just how awful the Gestapo really were. They were constantly interrogated while being beaten, kicked, walked on, and strung up by their arms backwards. They were hit with whips, clubs, and rifle butts until they drifted into unconsciousness. As soon as they started to come to, the torture would start all over again. After those 10 days, the Gestapo finally turned Joseph and the other 3 American prisoners over to the German army, who put them in the brutal prison camp called Stalag Luft III. Upon arrival, Joseph was immediately sentenced to 30 days inside a 4x5-foot pine box that was too small to stand up or lay down in. Fortunately for him, he only had to endure 7 days because a Red Cross operative from Geneva intervened on his behalf. It would take months for Joseph to get his strength back after being inside of this box, but as soon as he did, he began plotting his next escape. One night, Joseph, along with his 3 American prisoner buddies, managed to break through a prison wall and made a mad dash for freedom. But the Nazi prison guards saw them and opened fire on them. All 3 of Joseph's friends were shot and killed as they ran. Joseph got away, only to hear the faint barking of the German shepherds the Nazis had sent to hunt him down. So, in the freezing cold of Poland in January, Joseph leaped headfirst into a partially frozen river and swam over 2 miles down it before getting out and running blindly into the woods. Somehow, miraculously, he managed to reach Soviet lines before he froze to death. There, he spoke with the battalion commander, Alexandra Samasenko, an incredibly brave woman who holds the distinction of being the only female tank commander in all of World War II. Even though Joseph spoke very little Russian, he convinced her to let him join her unit, and so she gave him a gun and some ammunition, and she told him what their next objective was. It turns out they were going to liberate the same prison camp he had just escaped from. And so Joseph, alongside the Soviet Red Army that he now fought for, turned around and went to smash this prison camp. After the dust had settled, Joseph raided the main camp office and stole his defiant official prisoner of war photo that the Germans had taken of him on the first day he got captured. Joseph continued to fight alongside the Soviets across the Eastern Front for a couple of months. But when a German dive bomber blew up the tank that Joseph was riding on, he was badly wounded and evacuated to a Russian field hospital. There, he received a visit from Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the most important Soviet military commander in World War II, who was intrigued by the only non-Soviet in the hospital. He sat with Joseph and learned his story through an interpreter. Afterwards, he provided Joseph with official paperwork that would allow him to safely rejoin American forces. And so, in February of 1945, Joseph was sent to the United States Embassy in Moscow. But unfortunately, when he finally met a friendly American face after nearly a year of fighting behind enemy lines, they did not believe his story. They told him that Joseph R. Byerly had been killed in action on the 10th of June, 1944, and that they had already held a funeral mass in his honor in Muskegon, and that his obituary had already been printed in the local newspaper. But despite Joseph painstakingly going through his story over and over again, the ambassador just could not believe what he was hearing. Worried that Joseph might actually be a well-trained German spy, the ambassador sent him to Odessa to have his credentials verified. But Odessa had the same problem and could not verify him, so they sent him to Egypt. Egypt had the same problem, and they too could not verify his credentials, so they sent him to Italy, where they finally used his official fingerprints and confirmed that yes, this man is in fact the real Joseph R. Byerly. And so, on the 11th of April 1945, Joseph returned home to Muskegon, Michigan, and needless to say, his parents were very surprised to see him because they were completely convinced he had died 10 months earlier. Exactly 1 year later, Joseph would actually get married to his sweetheart in the exact same church that had held his funeral mass when everyone believed he was dead. Joseph was given the Purple Heart, and then in the 1990s, he was given additional presidential awards from United States President Bill Clinton, as well as the Russian President Boris Yeltsin. Joseph was also given a custom-made AK-47 from the guy who actually invented the AK-47, Mikhail Kalashnikov. Joseph died in 2004 at the age of 81, and his son would go on to become the United States ambassador to Russia under both President George W. Bush and President Barack Obama, completing an incredibly historic family legacy. Joseph died in 2004 at the age of 81, leaving behind one of the most extraordinary stories of World War II. But, believe it or not, there are even more unbelievable true stories just like this one. Click the next video on your screen, and I'll see you there. Sometimes, the choices we make and the secrets we keep can completely alter the course of human lives. In some cases, these choices are driven by a deep, aching desire to heal a broken past and find a way to make things right. In other cases, they are driven by greed, power, and a shocking level of corruption that completely blinds a person to the value of human life. And in the most tragic cases, they are driven by a quiet, toxic malice that operates completely outside the boundaries of the law, leaving behind a devastation that can never truly be repaired. Today, we are going to look at 3 incredible stories that show just how unpredictable and sometimes how utterly terrifying the human experience can be. We begin in the summer of 2007. A 60-year-old man named Michael Dick was living a very quiet, comfortable life in Bow, which is located in East London. Michael was a semi-retired carpenter, and if you were to look at his day-to-day routine, it was pretty normal. He spent most of his time helping out around the house, visiting with his close friends, and being with his family. He was well liked in his neighborhood, which was a peaceful, safe place to live. But even though his life seemed complete on the surface, Michael was harboring a deep, quiet sadness that had been growing inside of him for a very long time. 10 years earlier, back in 1997, Michael had gone through a very messy, painful divorce with his first wife. At the time of the split, they had a daughter together named Lisa, who was 21 years old. When the divorce was finalized, Michael decided he needed a fresh start to escape the bitterness of the separation. He packed up his things and moved about an hour and a half south down to Bow in East London. But his ex-wife and his daughter, Lisa, stayed behind in the family home, which was located in a quiet, historic town called Sudbury in the county of Suffolk, England. Because the divorce had been so hostile and bitter, the communication between Michael and his old family completely broke down. There were no phone calls, no letters, and no updates. As the weeks turned into months, and the months turned into years, Michael completely lost touch with his daughter Lisa. He did not know what she was doing with her life, whether she went to university, if she got married, or if she was even happy. It was like she had vanished from his world entirely. Fast forward 10 years to 2007. Michael is sitting in his home, and suddenly he is hit with this overwhelming, crushing wave of grief. He realized that a whole decade had passed, and he had missed out on his first daughter's entire young adulthood. The guilt of letting those 10 years slip away became absolutely too much for him to bear. He could not stop thinking about her. So he sat down with his current wife and his 2 younger daughters, and he told them that he had to go find Lisa. He needed to apologize for the lost time, and he wanted to rebuild a relationship with her if she would let him. His family was incredibly supportive. They told him he absolutely had to do it and that they would help him in any way they could. But the problem was, Michael had absolutely no idea where Lisa was. He did not have her phone number, he did not have an email address, and he had no way of contacting his ex-wife to ask for help because they had cut all ties. The only piece of information he had was the physical address of the brick house they had lived in 10 years ago in Sudbury. And so, in August of 2007, Michael decided that this old house was going to be his starting point. He got into the car with his 2 younger daughters, and they made the 90-minute drive north to Sudbury. When they arrived, Michael navigated through the familiar streets until he found his old neighborhood. It was a beautiful, quiet street lined with classic brick houses on both sides. He slowly drove down the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, until he spotted his old family home. He pulled the car over, parked right out front, and just sat there for a moment, staring at the front door. His heart was pounding with a mix of hope and sheer anxiety. He stepped out of the car alone, walked up the stone path, took a deep breath, and knocked on the door. After a few moments, the door opened. But the person standing there was not his ex-wife, and it was not Lisa. It was a completely different family who had moved in years after Michael left. Michael politely explained who he was and who he was looking for, but the new owners told him that they had bought the house from someone else and had no idea where the previous occupants had moved. They wished him the best of luck, but they had absolutely no information to give him. Michael thanked them, walked slowly back to his car, and sat in the driver's seat, feeling completely crushed. He looked at his daughters and told them that the trail was completely cold and he did not know what to do next. But his daughters refused to let him give up. They suggested that they just drive around Sudbury for a while. Maybe they would get incredibly lucky and spot Lisa walking down the street, or maybe just seeing the town would spark an idea. So they spent the next couple of hours just aimlessly driving around the streets of Sudbury, looking out the windows and talking about what they should do next. As they drove, they came to the realization that their best bet at finding Lisa was to get some sort of story in the local newspaper. They hoped that if they could get an article published, Lisa, or perhaps someone who knew her, would see it and contact Michael. So they drove to the headquarters of the local paper, the Suffolk Free Press, and went inside. They managed to speak to a reporter and explained Michael's situation. The reporter thought it was a very touching, interesting human interest story and agreed to write a small feature about Michael's search. The reporter, along with a photographer, brought Michael and his two younger daughters outside onto the street. The photographer had them stand together, and he took a picture of them. The reporter told Michael that in the next edition of the paper, which would run in just a few days, they would publish this picture along with a write-up about his search and his contact information. Michael thanked them profusely, feeling a tiny spark of hope. He and his daughters got back in the car and headed back to Bow, East London to wait. Now, what Michael did not know was that at that exact same time, Lisa was actually beginning to think about finding him too. Lisa was now 31 years old, she was married, she had 3 kids of her own, and she had moved out of Sudbury to a neighboring town. She had been talking to her mother and her friends about how she should go about finding her dad because she wanted her kids to have a relationship with him. But like Michael, she did not have his contact information, she did not have his phone number, and when she searched for him on social media, he was not on there. One day in August, Lisa was at her office. She went into the break room to get a drink, and she saw a copy of the Suffolk Free Press sitting on the coffee table. She picked it up and began casually flipping through the pages. Suddenly, she stopped. She saw a picture of herself. In the background of the main photo, she could clearly see herself and her mother walking along the street. She had been in Sudbury just a couple of days earlier to talk to her mom about how to find her dad, and they had walked down that very street. But then Lisa looked at the main subjects of the photo, the people standing in the foreground. It was a middle-aged man and 2 teenage girls. She stared at the man's face and nearly fell off her chair. It was her father, Michael, and her 2 stepsisters, whom she had never met. She looked at the caption for the photo and read the article. It explained that this man was desperately searching for his daughter, Lisa, whom he had not seen in 10 years. Purely by chance, on the only day Lisa had been in Sudbury talking to her mother about finding her father, she had been walking literally 100 feet behind her father and her stepsisters as they were having their picture taken for the newspaper ad. The photographer had captured all of them in the same frame without even realizing it. Lisa immediately read the article, got her father's contact information, and reached out to him. Initially, when Michael answered the phone and Lisa told him who she was and how she found him, he actually thought it was a scam. He did not believe it was actually her. But eventually she convinced him and he drove right back to Sudbury. They had an incredibly emotional reunion and Michael got to meet his grandchildren for the very first time. Today, they are still a close part of each other's lives, all because of an unbelievable 1 in a million coincidence captured in a single newspaper photograph. That is a story of a long search ending in a beautiful, almost miraculous way. But our next story takes us to a very different part of the world where a man's search for fame and power led to something incredibly dark and deeply disturbing. If you were to picture the Amazon rainforest in your head, you would probably imagine a dense, green, tropical wilderness filled with exotic animals and winding rivers. And you would be right. That is a very accurate representation of the Amazon. But what a lot of people do not know is that the Amazon rainforest is also home to a massive bustling city. It is called Manaus, and it sits right in the middle of the rainforest, right along the banks of the Amazon River. Manaus is a city of extremes, and unfortunately, it happens to be one of the most violent places in the entire world. In Manaus, the drug trade and gang violence are extremely prevalent. All it takes is walking down the wrong street or crossing the wrong person, and you can get shot or stabbed in broad daylight with virtually nothing anyone can do to stop it. The police are often overwhelmed, underfunded, and sometimes even complicit in the chaos. In 1989, a 31-year-old former police officer named Wallace Souza decided that he wanted to do something about the state of his hometown. He wanted to make a television show that would show people what it was actually like to live in Manaus. Now, there were other crime shows in Brazil at the time, but they often censored the most graphic content. They would blur out the bodies or avoid showing the true horror of the crime scenes. Wallace decided he was not going to do that. He felt that the only way to expose the harsh reality of life in Manaus was to show everything without any filter. So, that year, he launched a show called Canal Livre, which translates to Free Channel. True to his word, there was absolutely no filter on what went on the air. The show was shocking, raw, and incredibly graphic. Viewers were given a front row seat to freshly murdered victims, lying in the road, slumped over chairs in restaurants, or dead behind the steering wheels of their cars. The cameraman would zoom in on the fatal injuries, the blood spatter, and the faces of the deceased. They would show the grieving family members crying out in pain, completely raw and unedited. But in between these very dark, violent segments about gang killings and drug deals gone wrong, Canal Livre also had a much lighter, almost bizarre side. They would bring on local artists to talk about their work, or they would focus on down-on-their-luck families that needed help, using the show to raise money for them. And then, for seemingly no reason at all, there was a recurring segment where a puppet character would get into physical fights with a man selling bread. It was a totally strange, chaotic spectacle, and the people of Manaus absolutely loved it. Eventually, the show became incredibly popular, not just in Manaus, but across all of Brazil. Because Wallace was often on camera hosting the show, he became extremely famous and highly recognizable. When he walked down the streets of Manaus, people would see him and literally start clapping and cheering for him. He was seen as a hero who was brave enough to show the truth that the government wanted to hide. As his popularity grew, Wallace decided that he did not just want to report on crime, he wanted to fight it from a position of authority. On the air, he would constantly berate the government for failing to protect its citizens, and he would mock the police for their inability to catch criminals. Off the air, he decided to run for political office. He campaigned hard on a platform of law and order, promising to clean up the streets of Manaus. He was elected with a massive majority, and he quickly became one of the most beloved, influential, and trusted public figures in all of Brazil. However, over the years, there was one very strange thing about Canal Livre that some people began to notice. It was a detail that was hard to ignore, and it was most obvious in a now famous episode that aired in the mid-2000s. This particular episode opens with a Canal Livre reporter making their way through a dense patch of jungle. A cameraman is filming them from behind as they push branches out of the way and carefully step over the thick underbrush. Up ahead, there is a small clearing, and standing in this clearing is a third person who is looking down at something on the ground. The reporter finally makes his way into the clearing, and the cameraman follows, pointing the camera down at the ground. What you see on the ground looks like a black, charred log that is still smoking. But as the cameraman zooms in, you realize it is not a log at all. It is a human being. The body is badly burned and still actively smoking, meaning this person had been set on fire just minutes before the camera crew arrived. It was a horrifying sight. But then the reporter starts talking about the victim with an incredible amount of detail. He tells the audience that the victim is a man, that he had not been shot, and that he had been doused with gasoline and burned alive. The problem was, the police had not even arrived at the scene yet. No medical examiner had looked at the body, and because the body was so badly charred, it was virtually impossible to tell just by looking at it whether the victim was male, whether there were gunshot wounds, or what accelerant had been used. When people began to question how Canal Livre always managed to arrive at these crime scenes so quickly, and how they had so much detailed information before the police, Wallace had a quick answer. He told them that they were simply a very popular show with a huge network of informants, that people called them before they called the police, and that they constantly monitored police radios and the city morgue. For a long time, people accepted this explanation. But everything changed in October of 2008. That month, the police arrested a former Manaus police officer who went by the name Moa. He was accused of committing 9 murders and was thrown into jail. Despite the incredibly serious charges against him, Moa seemed completely unfazed. He acted like a man who knew he had powerful connections on the outside, someone who would step in at any moment and get him out of prison. But as the weeks went on, nobody came to save Moa. He just continued to sit in his cell, and eventually the reality of his situation began to sink in. He realized he had been abandoned. So he decided to start talking, and the story he told would shock the entire nation of Brazil. Moa admitted to the police that he had killed several people. But then he said that he was just a hitman. He claimed that the person who was hiring him to commit these murders was none other than Wallace Souza. The police began a massive, secret investigation. What they discovered was absolutely mind-blowing. It turned out that Wallace Souza had started Canal Livre with good intentions, but as the show became massively popular, it gave him an immense amount of power and influence. And that power corrupted him completely. Wallace had secretly formed his own powerful drug cartel. In order to protect his drug territory, eliminate his rivals, and boost his television show's ratings, Wallace had started hiring hitmen like Moa to assassinate rival gang members. Wallace would tell the hitmen exactly who to kill, where to do it, and at what exact time. Once the hit was planned, Wallace would coordinate with his news producers. He would send his camera crews to the exact location of the planned murder, timing it so they would arrive either right as the crime was happening or immediately after. This allowed Canal Livre to get the absolute most graphic, exclusive footage before any other news outlet and long before the police could even secure the scene. They were literally creating the news they were reporting on. It took the police a full year to compile enough evidence, but in October of 2009, they finally charged Wallace Souza with murder, conspiracy, and drug trafficking. Wallace initially went on the run, but he eventually turned himself in, maintaining his innocence and claiming that he was the victim of a political conspiracy. However, Wallace would never stand trial. Before his case could go before a judge, he suffered a massive heart attack and died in prison in 2010. Because of his death, the full extent of his crimes was never fully revealed, and we will never know exactly how many people he had killed for the sake of his television ratings. But investigators were able to prove that at least 3 of the victims shown on Canal Livre had been killed directly on Wallace's orders, including the man who had been burned alive in the jungle. But the story does not end there. The person who paid the ultimate price for exposing this massive conspiracy was Moa, the hitman who had blown the whistle on Wallace. On New Year's Day in 2017, a massive violent prison riot broke out at the facility where Moa was being held. A powerful crime syndicate overran the guards and took control of the prison, and they had a specific list of targets they wanted to eliminate. One of those targets was Moa, whom they viewed as a traitor for cooperating with the police. An angry mob of armed inmates made their way to Moa's cell. When they found him, Moa was pressed flat against the back wall of his cell, as far away from the bars as he could possibly get, pleading for his life. The mob, armed with machetes and knives, began hacking at the cell door, trying to break the lock to get inside and cut him to pieces. But the lock was too strong, and they could not get the door open. Realizing they could not reach him with their blades, they decided to do something else. They reached through the bars with a lighter and set Moa's mattress on fire. The flames quickly spread, filling the tiny cell with thick, toxic smoke and intense heat. With nowhere to run and no way to escape, Moa was trapped. He was burned alive inside his cell, suffering the exact same horrific fate that he and Wallace had inflicted on their victims years before. This is a terrifying example of how greed and a desire for control can lead to absolute horror. But sometimes, control does not come from a drug cartel or a television show. Sometimes it comes from someone you trust completely, someone you consider to be your very best friend. And that brings us to our third and final story, which took place in Sydney, Australia. In 2010, an 18-year-old girl named Renee Marsden was living in Sydney with her parents and her 3 siblings. Renee was a very bright, outgoing, and popular young woman who had a large circle of friends. She was also incredibly close with her family, especially with her mother, Teresa. Teresa had given birth to Renee when she was only 19 years old. Because of their relatively close age gap as Renee grew into a young woman, their relationship evolved from a traditional mother-daughter dynamic into a deep, trusting friendship. Renee saw her mother as her ultimate confidant. She would come home and tell Teresa absolutely everything that was going on in her life, from her daily routines to her deepest secrets. In 2010, Renee was going through a very difficult time. She had been dating a young man for nearly 2 years, and she was madly in love with him. But one day, she discovered a series of text messages that made it clear he was cheating on her and did not really care about her. Renee was completely heartbroken. She confronted her boyfriend with the messages, but he completely denied sending them. He swore up and down that he had never cheated on her, that he loved her, and that he had no idea where those messages had come from. But Renee, feeling betrayed and confused, did not believe him. She felt she had no choice but to break up with him. During this painful period, Renee spent hours talking to her mother, crying and trying to process the end of her relationship. Teresa did her best to comfort her daughter, telling her that time heals all wounds and that she would eventually find the right person who would treat her with the respect she deserved. For a couple of weeks, Renee was deeply depressed. She barely wanted to leave her room. But then, quite suddenly, she came home from work one day and walked through the front door with a massive smile on her face. She was practically radiating happiness, which was a huge contrast to how she had been acting. Teresa immediately noticed the change and asked her what had happened to put her in such a great mood. Renee smiled and told her mother that she had met a new guy. Teresa was thrilled to see her daughter happy again, and she eagerly asked who this new person was. Renee explained that his name was Braden Spiteri. He was 23 years old, and he came from a very wealthy, prominent family. He had graduated from the King's School, which is an extremely prestigious boys' school in Sydney, and his father owned a highly successful construction company that Braden was set to inherit. Renee described him as handsome, kind, and absolutely perfect. Teresa asked how they had met, and Renee explained that her best friend, Camilla Zidon, had introduced them. Camilla and Renee had been best friends since high school, and Camilla was always over at the Marsden house, so Teresa knew her very well. Renee told her mother that Braden was actually Camilla's ex-boyfriend, but they had dated a long time ago, and there were absolutely no lingering feelings between them. They were just good friends now. According to Renee, Camilla had seen how depressed Renee was after her breakup, and she wanted to help her find happiness again. So, Camilla had set her up with Braden. When Teresa heard this, a small red flag went up in her mind. She knew that dating a best friend's ex-boyfriend could easily lead to drama and hurt feelings, even if everyone claimed to be fine with it. She looked at Renee and asked if she really thought it was a good idea to get involved with Camilla's ex. But Renee quickly brushed her concerns aside, saying that Camilla was completely supportive and just wanted her to be happy. Still feeling a bit uneasy, Teresa asked to see a picture of this new guy. Renee pulled out her phone and showed her a photo of Braden. He was indeed a very handsome young man with a bright, welcoming smile. But as Teresa looked closer at the photo, she noticed something that made her uncomfortable. In the picture, Camilla was leaning her head heavily on Braden's shoulder, looking very much like his girlfriend. Teresa kept her thoughts to herself, but she could not shake the feeling that this situation was complicated and potentially dangerous. Over the next few weeks and months, Renee's relationship with Braden seemed to blossom rapidly. They were texting each other constantly, day and night. Renee had her phone out almost 24 hours a day, smiling at her screen as she exchanged messages with Braden. But as the months went by, Teresa noticed something odd. Renee and Braden had still not met up in person since they began officially dating. Every single time they made plans to meet, something would come up at the last minute. Either Braden would have an emergency at work, or Renee would have a family conflict. It was always some seemingly legitimate excuse, but it happened every single time. Eventually, the couple stopped trying to arrange face-to-face meetings altogether. It was as if they had built this incredibly intense, emotional relationship entirely through their phone screens, and actually meeting in person had become too intimidating or awkward. They were completely content just living in this digital world together. This unusual text-only relationship continued for nearly a year until January of 2012, when a massive tragedy struck. Braden was involved in a horrific motorcycle accident. He survived the crash, but his passenger, who was also his best friend, a young man named Richie, did not survive. He was killed instantly. The police investigated the accident and determined that Braden had been driving recklessly, and he was subsequently charged with manslaughter. He was convicted and sentenced to 2 years in prison. When Teresa heard about the accident, she felt a complex mix of emotions. On one hand, she felt terrible for the young man who had lost his life and for Braden's family. But on the other hand, a protective, motherly part of her felt a sense of relief. She assumed that with Braden going to prison for 2 years, the relationship would naturally come to an end. She hoped that Renee would finally move on and find someone she could actually spend time with in the real world. But that is not what happened. Braden was sent to Goulburn Prison, a high-security facility located about 2 hours south of Sydney. Shortly after he arrived, Renee informed her family that Braden's family had somehow managed to smuggle a mobile phone into the prison for him. And just like that, their constant texting resumed, as if nothing had changed. Renee's family was deeply unhappy about this. They tried to talk to her, telling her that she was wasting her youth on a man in prison and that this relationship was heading down a very dark and difficult path. But Renee refused to listen. She was completely devoted to Braden. In fact, over the next several months, their relationship only grew more intense. They made plans to get married as soon as Braden was released, which was scheduled for late 2013. Renee was overjoyed and began throwing herself into wedding preparations. She spent hours online buying a beautiful wedding tiara on eBay, booking a professional photographer, and even contacting the Greek consulate to see if Braden, as a convicted felon, would be allowed to enter Greece for their planned honeymoon. But then, in August of 2013, just 2 months before Braden's scheduled release date, everything began to unravel in a very strange way. One afternoon, Teresa received a text message on her phone. It was from Braden, which was highly unusual because he rarely communicated with Teresa directly. The message was frantic. It told Teresa that she needed to check on Renee immediately because she was talking about ending her life. Terrified, Teresa ran straight to Renee's bedroom. She found Renee sitting quietly on her bed. Teresa sat down beside her, put a comforting hand on her shoulder, and asked if she was okay and what was going on. Renee looked up, seemingly confused, and said that she was fine, and asked why her mother was asking. Teresa showed her the text message from Braden. As soon as Renee saw the screen, her face fell. She let out a heavy sigh, looked at her mother, and said that they had just broken up and that their relationship was completely over. She insisted that she was not going to hurt herself, but that she was just incredibly sad. Teresa felt a sudden wave of relief mixed with deep sympathy for her daughter. She knew how painful breakups were, but she also believed that this was the best possible outcome for Renee's future. She stayed with Renee for a while, talking and comforting her until Renee seemed to calm down. Renee then told her mother that she wanted to go out that night with her friends to try and clear her head and forget about the breakup. Teresa thought this was a healthy idea. She sat on the bed and watched as Renee stood in front of the mirror, putting on her makeup and getting dressed up. When she was ready, Renee gave her mother a tight hug, kissed her on the cheek, and said she would see her later. Then she walked out the door. A few hours later, Teresa's phone buzzed. It was a text message from Renee. But as Teresa read the message, her heart sank. The text began with Renee saying how much she loved her mother and how sorry she was for the pain she was about to cause her. She wrote that if Teresa ever wanted to talk to her, she just had to call out her name and she would be there. Teresa was instantly gripped by panic. She did not fully understand what the message meant, but she knew it sounded like a goodbye. She immediately dialed Renee's number, but it went straight to voicemail. She called again and again, but there was no answer. She sent a desperate text message begging Renee to call her back, but she received no response. In a state of pure terror, Teresa called Camilla, Renee's best friend. She asked Camilla if she had heard from Renee or knew where she was. Camilla sounded shocked and told Teresa that she had actually just received a very similar frightening text message from Renee that simply said she loved her and was sorry. The two women decided they had to find her immediately. They met up and spent the next several hours driving frantically all over Sydney, checking every place they thought Renee might go. But there was no sign of her anywhere. Eventually, feeling completely helpless, they drove back to Teresa's house. By this time, Teresa's husband and Renee's siblings were all awake, gathered in the living room, waiting in agonizing silence for any news. At around 9:30 that night, there was a loud knock on the front door. Teresa ran to open it, hoping it was Renee. But instead, she was met by two police officers. The officers explained that they had found Renee's car parked in an unauthorized area, but she was not inside or anywhere near the vehicle. They had come to the family home to see if they knew where she was. When the family explained these suicidal text messages, the officers' faces grew grave. Without hesitating, Teresa and her husband ran to their car and drove straight to the location where the police had found Renee's vehicle. The car was parked in a beautiful but notorious area of Sydney known as the Gap. The Gap is a famous peninsula characterized by steep sandstone cliffs that drop directly into the churning ocean below. It is a place of incredible natural beauty, but it is also tragically well known as a site where many people go to end their lives. When the parents arrived, they rushed to Renee's car and searched it, but it was empty. They began running up and down the paved walking paths that lined the edge of the cliffs, calling out Renee's name into the dark, windy night. But there was no answer, only the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks far below. As Teresa searched, she climbed up to one of the highest lookout points on the cliff. There, on the ground, right in front of the safety fence designed to keep people away from the edge, she found something that shattered her heart. Placed neatly side by side on the gravel were Renee's flat black shoes. The police conducted an extensive search of the cliffs and the water below that night, but because of the darkness and the rough sea conditions, they could find no sign of Renee. The following day, investigators located a security camera that was positioned to monitor that specific section of the Gap. They pulled the footage from the previous night and began to watch. On the video, they saw Renee. She was walking slowly up the trail, alone in the dark. She stopped near the lookout point, bent down, took off her shoes, and placed them neatly together on the ground. Then she climbed over the safety fence. The fence was set back a few feet from the actual drop-off. The footage showed Renee taking a few steps toward the sheer edge and peeking over into the abyss. She looked visibly terrified. She took a few steps backward, pressing her back flat against the safety fence. She pulled out her phone and stood there for a few moments, typing. This was the moment she sent the 3 final text messages. One was to her mother, one was to Camilla, and one was to Braden. Once the messages were sent, Renee took her phone and threw it far out over the edge, watching as it disappeared into the ocean. Then she sat down on the ground and began to shimmy herself slowly forward toward the edge of the cliff until she went out of the camera's frame. It was clear to the investigators that Renee had jumped to her death. Despite search efforts, her body was never recovered from the ocean. The family was absolutely destroyed. They could not understand how a young woman who had been planning her wedding, buying a tiara, and looking forward to her future just days before could suddenly decide to end her life. They were convinced that the key to understanding her death lay with Braden Spiteri. They believed that whatever had happened during their sudden breakup had pushed her over the edge. They tried to contact Braden, but his phone was disconnected. Desperate for answers, they contacted the police and asked them to arrange a meeting with Braden at Goulburn Prison, where he was supposedly serving his sentence. The police agreed and contacted the administration at Goulburn Prison to inquire about an inmate named Braden Spiteri. But when the prison officials checked their records, they told the police something that sent a chill down their spines. They had no record of anyone named Braden Spiteri. Not only was he not currently at the prison, but no one by that name had ever been incarcerated there. The police began a deeper investigation into this mysterious young man. They traced the phone records, the social media accounts, and the IP addresses associated with Braden Spiteri. And what they uncovered was a level of deception that was almost impossible to comprehend. Braden Spiteri did not exist. He was a completely fictitious person. And the person who had created him, the person who had been texting Renee day and night for nearly 2 years, pretending to be the love of her life, was none other than her best friend, Camilla Zaiden. The photograph that Renee had shown her mother, the one where Camilla was resting her head on Braden's shoulder, was not a photo of Camilla's ex-boyfriend. It was just a photo of a completely random guy that Camilla had met once at a nightclub and asked to take a picture with. She had used his face to create this entire elaborate lie. As the police dug deeper into the girl's history, a horrifying pattern of toxic, obsessive control began to emerge. It turned out that Camilla had been deeply, pathologically possessive of Renee ever since they met in high school. She did not want anyone else to have Renee's attention or affection. When Renee had started dating her previous boyfriend of 2 years, Camilla had grown incredibly jealous. In order to destroy that relationship and regain control over Renee, Camilla had secretly fabricated the cheating text messages. She had created fake accounts, sent those messages to herself or to Renee, and then convinced Renee that her boyfriend was a liar and a cheat. Trusting her best friend completely, Renee had broken off the relationship exactly as Camilla had planned. Then, seeing how devastated Renee was, Camilla had swooped in to play the hero. She created the persona of Braden Spiteri, a wealthy, perfect man who would heal Renee's broken heart. Camilla had spent the next 2 years living a double life. She would spend the day hanging out with Renee in person as her best friend, and then spend the night texting Renee as Braden, whispering sweet, romantic things to her through a fake phone number. But the facade began to crack in June of 2013. During an intense text conversation with Braden, Renee had opened up about her frustrations with her real-life friend, Camilla. She told Braden that Camilla had become incredibly toxic, mean, and controlling, and that she was seriously considering ending her friendship with her. On the other end of the phone, Camilla was reading these messages. She was furious. She realized that despite all her efforts to control Renee, Renee was starting to see through her and wanted to push her away. Camilla's obsession turned into a dark desire for revenge. She decided that if she could not control Renee, she would destroy her. And she would use the character of Braden to do it. On the afternoon of the 5th of August, 2013, Renee was out having lunch with a coworker. She was happy, planning her future wedding, when she suddenly received a cold, abrupt text message from Braden out of the blue saying that he needed a break from her and that it was over. Renee was completely blindsided and devastated. She tried calling him repeatedly, but the call would not go through. Desperate and confused, she decided to do something she had never done before. She called Goulburn Prison directly, hoping to speak to a guard or an administrator who could help her get in touch with Braden. The call was placed at 2:45 that afternoon. While we do not know the exact details of the conversation, it is almost certain that the prison staff informed Renee that there was no inmate named Braden Spiteri at their facility. In that single, horrifying moment, the illusion shattered. Renee would have realized that the man she had loved for 2 years, the man she was planning to marry, was a total lie. And as she began to connect the dots, she would have realized that the person behind this cruel, elaborate deception was her very best friend, Camilla. The embarrassment, the shock, and the absolute betrayal were too much for Renee's 18-year-old mind to process. She felt completely violated, foolish, and deeply broken. She could not bring herself to confess this massive, humiliating truth to her mother, who was her confidant. The weight of the realization was so heavy that she felt she could not survive it. And so, later that evening, she walked out of her house and made the tragic journey to the Gap Cliffs. When the truth finally came out, Renee's family demanded justice. They wanted Camilla to be held criminally responsible for what she had done, for driving their daughter to her death. But they were met with a harsh, frustrating reality. In Australia, as in many parts of the world at the time, there were no laws against catfishing. Creating a fake online persona and using it to deceive someone, even if it leads to devastating psychological harm, was not considered a criminal offense. Because Camilla had not physically forced Renee to jump, she could not be charged with any crime related to her death. Throughout the inquest and the media coverage that followed, Camilla refused to take any responsibility for what happened. She never apologized to Renee's family, and she never showed any remorse for the incredible devastation she had caused. Today, Renee's family is left with a profound, lingering grief and a sense of anger that may never truly fade. They are forced to live with the knowledge that the person who destroyed their daughter's life is walking free, completely unpunished by the law. The story of Renee Marsden is a haunting reminder of the dark side of our connected world. It shows us that the people we think we know, the people we let into our lives and our hearts, can sometimes be the very ones who are plotting our destruction. And it leaves us with the unsettling truth that sometimes the most horrific acts of cruelty can be committed without ever breaking a single law on the books. These 3 stories, from the miraculous reunion of Michael and Lisa, to the bloody, corrupt empire of Wallace Sousa, and finally to the tragic digital betrayal of Renee Marsden, show us the incredible spectrum of human behavior. They remind us of the power of our actions, the weight of the choices we make, and the enduring, sometimes devastating consequences that follow them. And the 3rd story is the one that people still debate to this day. Because depending on your perspective, it might not even be considered a crime. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you're not ready to stop, there's another story waiting for you right now. In the early hours of Saturday, the 19th of October, 2013, a 23-year-old man named Ode Edgelor stood at a crowded bar in a dance club in Antwerp, Belgium. The air was thick with the beat of the music and the energy of the crowd. The bartender slid 2 shot glasses across the slick surface of the bar, and Ode expertly scooped them up. He turned, a grin on his face, and handed one to his friend, Kevin Rodriguez Fuentes, who was waiting right behind him. It was Kevin's birthday, and the night was all about celebrating. Ode raised his glass high. Over the thumping bass, he shouted, "Happy birthday," in his native Spanish. Kevin grinned back, and together they tilted their heads back and slammed down the shots. The burn of the liquor was just another part of the night's excitement. Ode was relatively new to Antwerp. He had moved from Spain about 6 months earlier for a great job as a computer engineer. It was a big step, moving to a new country where he didn't know a soul. But Ode was outgoing and friendly, and it didn't take him long to start building a new life. He'd met Kevin at a local beer festival not long after he arrived. They hit it off immediately. Kevin was from the area, so he took Ode under his wing, introducing him to his circle of friends and showing him all the best places to go out in the city. They became close, fast. Back in the club, after the shots, Kevin tapped Ode on the shoulder. He pointed towards the middle of the dance floor, a wide smile spreading across his face. A group of young women, about their age, were dancing together. Without another word, the two friends made their way through the crowd and onto the dance floor. From that point on, the night dissolved into a happy, energetic blur for Ode. He went back and forth between dancing with their new friends and heading to the bar for more drinks. He was having an amazing time. It was nights exactly like this that were making Antwerp feel less like a foreign city and more like a real home. But as the hours wore on, he could feel the alcohol catching up to him. He knew that if he stayed much longer, he risked passing out right there. Sometime later, Ode, Kevin, and a few of the new friends they'd met stumbled out of the club's doors and into the cool night air. The city streets were quiet and mostly empty. Ode instinctively pulled his phone from his pocket to check the time. His vision was blurry, and he had to squint, but he could make out the numbers on the screen. It was nearly 4 a.m. It was incredibly late, practically the next morning. He knew it was time to call it a night. He said his goodbyes to the group, wished Kevin a final happy birthday, and then turned to begin the walk home. The next morning, Kevin woke up in his bed with a skull-splitting headache. He blinked his eyes open, his room slowly coming into focus. He let out a sigh of relief. He was home, safe. The last part of the night was a complete fog. He honestly couldn't remember how he'd even gotten back to his apartment. He groaned, rolled over, and fumbled for his phone on the nightstand. It was a reflexive move for anyone after a long night out. He sent a group text to Ode and another friend who had been with them, asking the simple question, "How are you feeling?" The other friend replied almost immediately, complaining about his own hangover. But there was no reply from Ode. At first, Kevin didn't think much of it. Ode had been drinking just as much as he had. He was probably still sound asleep, trying to recover. He figured he'd hear from him later in the day. But the day passed, and still nothing. The sun went down, and Kevin's phone remained silent. By the next day, which was Sunday, October 20th, with still no word from Ode, Kevin's casual concern started to turn into real worry. This was unusual. He decided to call Ode directly. He put the phone to his ear, but it didn't ring. It went straight to voicemail. That meant his phone was either dead or turned off. This small detail sent a jolt of anxiety through Kevin. Ode was always good about keeping his phone charged and was usually quick to respond to messages. 24 hours of silence was not like him at all, not even with the worst hangover. Kevin immediately called the other friend from their group. He asked if he'd heard anything from Ode. The friend said no, he hadn't spoken to him since they all left the club. The worry was now escalating into a quiet panic. Kevin decided he needed to go check on him in person. He got dressed and headed over to Ode's apartment. When he arrived, he found Ode's roommates at home, but Ode wasn't there. The roommates didn't know Ode all that well. They were more just people who shared a living space. They told Kevin that Ode hadn't come home after the birthday party. They just assumed he was crashing at a friend's place for the weekend and hadn't thought anything of it. But for Kevin, this was a huge red flag. O'Day would have told him if he was staying somewhere else. They were close friends. He would have been the first to know. The panic was no longer quiet. As he stood there in O'Day's empty room, his mind raced, trying to think of any possible explanation. Then, a thought struck him. He remembered that one of their mutual friends, a young woman named Owen, had gone out of town for a wedding. Maybe, just maybe, O'Day had made a last-minute decision to go with her. It was a long shot, but it was the only logical explanation he could come up with. He left the apartment and immediately called Owen. He was hoping she would pick up and tell him that O'Day was right there with her, that everything was fine. But when she answered, he could hear the panic in her voice, too. It turned out she had also been trying to reach O'Day for the past day, calling and texting him nonstop with no response. She was just as worried as he was. The reality of the situation crashed down on Kevin. No one had seen or heard from O'Day since he left the group at 4 a.m. to walk home. He was just gone. Kevin felt a wave of helplessness wash over him, but he knew he couldn't just stand there. His friend could be in trouble. He took a deep breath, his hands shaking slightly, and he contacted the police to officially report O'Day Edgelor as a missing person. The following day, Monday, October 21st, Kevin found himself sitting in a small, sterile room at the police station across from two detectives from the Belgian National Police's Missing Persons Unit. As they began to ask him questions, the meeting quickly became frustrating for everyone involved. Kevin tried his best to recount the events of the night, but his memory was a haze of blurry images and fragmented conversations. He had been just as drunk as O'Day. He felt a deep sense of guilt for not being able to provide more details. But he did manage to recall a few crucial things. He remembered exactly what O'Day had been wearing, a gray hooded sweatshirt and a very distinctive black and white checkered scarf. He also knew the specific area of the city where they had been out. But that was about it. When he left the police station, Kevin felt like he had failed his friend. The idea of just going home to sit and wait while the police conducted their search was unbearable. O'Day could be hurt somewhere, needing help. He had to do something more. That afternoon, Kevin met up with Owen and a few of O'Day's other friends. Together, they printed hundreds of posters with O'Day's picture on them. They spent the rest of the day and evening plastering them all over the city on telephone poles, in shop windows, at bus stops. Antwerp was a bustling city, with bars and restaurants open late into the night. Surely someone must have seen a young man in a black and white checkered scarf walking home. People don't just vanish into thin air. Meanwhile, the detectives got to work. Kevin hadn't given them much, but what he did provide was a starting point. Knowing the general location and what O'Day was wearing turned out to be incredibly useful. Police began the methodical process of collecting CCTV surveillance footage from businesses and street cameras in the area where O'Day was last seen. They painstakingly reviewed hours and hours of footage, looking for a glimpse of that gray hoodie and checkered scarf. It didn't take them long to find him. On one camera, they saw O'Day walking alone down a dimly lit side street just as Kevin had described. His distinctive scarf stood out clearly, even on the grainy nighttime footage. The investigators were hoping the footage would show him getting into a taxi, or meeting up with someone, or even just going into a building. But what they saw next made them lean in closer to the monitor. Out of the deep shadows of a doorway, a figure suddenly emerged. The man rushed towards O'Day. It was an ambush. The man attacked O'Day, and in the brief struggle, he snatched what looked like O'Day's wallet from his pocket. Then, just as quickly as he appeared, the attacker took off running, disappearing down the street. The investigators weren't entirely surprised. While Antwerp was a relatively safe city, muggings did happen, especially to people who were visibly intoxicated and walking home alone late at night. It was a disturbing piece of evidence, but it was also a solid lead. But their investigation was about to take a truly bizarre turn. They continued to track O'Day's path through the city's network of cameras. On footage from a different camera, just a few minutes after the first mugging, they saw O'Day again. He had clearly pulled himself together and was still trying to make his way home. He was still walking alone. But then, it happened again. Suddenly, two new men appeared and rushed him. They attacked him, and this time, they took his phone. Then, like the first mugger, they sprinted off into the darkness, leaving O'Day alone on the street once again. The detectives in the room stared at the screen in disbelief. In the span of just a few minutes, O'Day had been mugged twice by 3 different people. None of them had ever seen anything like it. It felt like a scene from a movie, something so unlucky it was almost unbelievable. Now, they had a new set of questions. Were these 3 attackers working together? Was it some kind of coordinated attack? Or was it just a case of extraordinarily bad luck? They didn't know, but they now had a clear objective. The muggers had stolen O'Day's wallet and his cell phone. That meant they could track the credit cards and the phone's data. They hoped this digital trail would lead them directly to the attackers. Once they had the muggers in custody, they believed they would get the answers they needed to find O'Day. The investigators' plan took a few days to execute, but it worked perfectly. They tracked O'Day's stolen credit card and discovered that someone had tried to use it at an ATM in the city. They immediately pulled the surveillance footage from that ATM and got a clear picture of the first mugger. Then, using cell phone tower data, they were able to trace the path of O'Day's stolen phone. By cross-referencing that data with CCTV footage along the route, they managed to identify the other 2 attackers from the second mugging. They now had all 3 men. They were confident that the mystery of O'Day's disappearance was about to be solved. Fast forward to October 29th. It had been 10 long days since O'Day had vanished, and there was still no sign of him. The police brought the 3 muggers in for questioning, interviewing each of them separately. The detectives laid it all out on the table. They told them they had a mountain of evidence: CCTV footage, ATM photos, cell phone data. They knew they were the ones who had robbed O'Day moments before he disappeared. There was no point in denying it. And to their surprise, none of the men did. All 3 of them freely admitted to robbing O'Day. They told the police exactly what they had stolen. But they all insisted on 2 things. First, their attacks were not coordinated in any way. It was a complete coincidence that they had both targeted the same person within minutes of each other. And second, and more importantly, they all swore that they had absolutely nothing to do with his disappearance. They said they just robbed him and ran. That was it. The investigators listened to their stories with deep skepticism. The idea that 3 criminals had randomly and separately mugged the same man, who then coincidentally vanished in a third unrelated incident, seemed almost laughably improbable. It defied all logic. They pressed the men hard, convinced they were lying, convinced they were hiding a much darker secret. But no matter how much pressure they applied, their stories never changed. We mugged him, we ran away, and we never saw him again. The police arrested and held all 3 men on robbery charges. But their primary goal was still to connect them to O'Day's disappearance. They were sure that with enough time, one of them would crack and tell the truth about what really happened to him. But then, another piece of surveillance footage surfaced from a camera further down the street. And this new footage changed everything. It showed O'Day just moments after the second mugging had occurred. And just as the muggers had claimed, the video showed them running away in the opposite direction. More importantly, it showed O'Day alone, dusting himself off for a second time, and then continuing to walk down the street, eventually moving out of the camera's frame. He was alone. To their absolute astonishment, the police had to accept that the muggers might have been telling the truth all along. This meant that after being violently robbed twice, O'Day had simply kept walking through the streets of Antwerp. Their best and only lead had just evaporated. The investigation was back at square one. This new footage also meant that the search area was now much, much larger. They had to search the entire city. In early November 2013, about 2 weeks after O'Day vanished, the Belgian National Police launched a massive search operation across Antwerp. They went back to every bar, club, and restaurant in the area where O'Day had been. They re-interviewed staff and patrons, showing O'Day's picture, asking if anyone remembered seeing him. But everywhere they went, they hit a dead end. No one knew anything. As the days turned into weeks, the focus of the search slowly shifted northward, following the general direction O'Day had been walking when he was last seen on camera. This path was leading them away from the city center and towards the banks of the River Scheldt, a wide, dark river that cuts through Antwerp on its way to the North Sea. On the evening of November 7th, 19 days after O'Day was last seen, a few detectives found themselves standing on the deck of a very unique structure floating on the River Scheldt. It was called the Boat. Earlier that day, police boats had been dragging the riverbed while search dogs patrolled the banks, looking for any sign of O'Day. A visit to the Boat was a necessary part of this river search. The Boat was a massive entertainment venue, a club, a bar, and a high-end restaurant, all built onto a converted ship that was permanently moored in the river. But its main attraction, the thing that drew crowds from all over, was an almost Olympic-sized swimming pool built right into the deck. It gave the incredible illusion of a pool floating on the surface of the river. It was known as the world's largest floating swimming pool, and it was always busy. The detectives hoped that because of the boat's excellent, unobstructed view of the river and the surrounding banks, someone there might have seen something on the morning O'Day went missing. They split up and began interviewing the staff and patrons, asking the same question they'd asked hundreds of times. Did you see a young man wearing a black and white checkered scarf? By now, nearly everyone in the city knew about O'Day's case. His face was on posters everywhere. People were eager to help, trying to recall any small detail that might be useful. But despite their best intentions, no one on the boat had any meaningful information. The investigators left empty-handed and spent the rest of the day watching the fruitless search of the river. On the 19th of November 2013, 1 full month after O'Day's disappearance, his friends and family held public gatherings in both Antwerp and his hometown in the Basque Country of Spain. His family in Spain made it clear this was not a memorial. They were holding on to the hope that O'Day was still alive somewhere. The gathering was a show of love and an effort to keep his story in the public eye. In Antwerp, his friends tried to send the same message of hope. But as 2013 came to a close, that hope was beginning to fade. The police investigation had stalled completely. The 3 muggers were still in custody, but they hadn't changed their stories. The citywide canvass had yielded nothing. O'Day's friends and family began to fear the worst, that the police, with no new leads to follow, would simply give up. But then, in the early summer of 2014, something incredible happened. More than 7 months after he disappeared, O'Day's story suddenly went viral. It spread far beyond Belgium and Spain, capturing the attention of people all across Europe. This was highly unusual. Thousands of people go missing every year, and most cases barely make the local news. But there was something about O'Day's story, the young engineer starting a new life, the unbelievable double mugging, the complete mystery of his vanishing that resonated deeply with people. It felt impossibly tragic. Just as it seemed the official investigation was winding down, a massive public outcry demanded the opposite. People from all over the continent called for the Belgian police. The international support was overwhelming. Poets wrote poems about O'Day. Musicians wrote songs for him. Charity groups organized their own volunteer searches in Belgium. It was as if the world was rallying together with a single voice. Find O'Day. The tipping point came in October 2014, as the first anniversary of his disappearance approached. One of the most famous soccer players in the world, Cristiano Ronaldo, played a match wearing a jersey with images of O'Day on it. The message reached millions. The pressure on the Belgian government became immense, and they responded. The Belgian National Police officially redoubled their efforts, expanding the search to the entire country. They even enlisted the help of Interpol to extend the search into other European nations. Throughout 2014 and into 2015, investigators revisited every lead, re-interviewed every witness, and made regular public announcements to show they were still actively searching. But despite this monumental effort, they found nothing. Ode was still gone. Then, on the 18th of September 2015, nearly 2 years after Ode's disappearance, a strange incident involving the boat would ultimately lead to the answer. The boat itself was essentially a large, flat, floating platform, more like a huge dock than a traditional ship with a deep hull. On that day, the massive swimming pool on its deck started to leak. Because the pool was recessed into the deck, its bottom was submerged just below the surface of the river. A breach in the pool's base caused it to take on water from the river, and the immense weight of it all became too much. The entire swimming pool structure broke away from the main boat and sank to the bottom of the river Scheldt. Luckily, no one was hurt, but the story made local headlines. The boat was a major city attraction. The city quickly began making plans to salvage the sunken pool. On the 11th of February 2016, almost 2.5 years after Ode vanished, the recovery operation began. 2 massive cranes mounted on a barge were brought in. Cables were lowered and attached to the sunken pool. A member of the work crew stood on the barge, watching intently as the cranes slowly, carefully began to lift their heavy load from the riverbed. The water churned as the massive structure was raised. Soon, the top edge of the swimming pool broke the surface. A few workers let out a small cheer. But the crew member on the barge saw something else. Something in the water, caught on the rising structure. At first, he couldn't make it out. He leaned over the side for a better look. His eyes widened in horror. He immediately shouted for the crane operator to stop. The whining of the cranes fell silent. With a shaking hand, the crew member pulled out his phone and dialed the police. After a thorough forensic investigation, the police were finally able to piece together what happened to Ode Ejiofor on that tragic night. At around 4 a.m., on the 19th of October 2013, after leaving his friends, Ode started his walk home. He was mugged twice in rapid succession. After the second attack, he was hurt, scared, and extremely disoriented from the alcohol and the trauma. He tried to continue on his way, but he was lost. Sometime later, he encountered a group of strangers who saw his condition beat up and confused and tried to help him. They offered to call him a taxi, but Ode was so disoriented he didn't even seem to understand them. He just wandered off into the night. By this point, he had walked far off course, ending up near the banks of the river Scheldt, nowhere near his home. At some point, in his drunken and confused state, he got too close to the river's edge. He stumbled, lost his footing, and fell into the cold, dark water. The shock of the icy water may have sobered him slightly, but he was too intoxicated to fight the strong current effectively. The river pulled him along, eventually sweeping him up against the side of the boat. He was trapped there, pinned against the hull by the current, right next to the recessed swimming pool. He was exhausted and too weak to swim away. He struggled to keep his head above water, but eventually, he had no energy left. The current pulled him under the surface and forced him into the small space between the bottom of the swimming pool and the riverbed. He became wedged there, and he drowned. For more than 2 years, Ode's body remained trapped beneath that swimming pool. Thousands of people swam and partied just a few feet above him, completely unaware. It was only when the pool sank and was later raised by the cranes that his body was finally discovered, still entangled with the structure that had hidden him for so long. The 3 men who mugged Ode were ultimately convicted of robbery and each served about 4 years in prison. They were never directly linked to his death. While the authorities concluded that the most likely scenario was a tragic accident where Ode simply fell into the river, they were never able to officially rule out the possibility of foul play. To this day, Ode's parents have called for the investigation to be reopened, still searching for definitive answers and closure for the loss of their son. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. On a warm afternoon, the 23rd of June 2014, a 49-year-old man named Patrior hurried out of a hospital in Sète, France. He was a janitor there, and his shift had just ended at 4:30 p.m. As he rushed towards the parking lot, he was fumbling with the buttons on his fresh-collared shirt. He was clearly in a hurry, not wanting to be late. He got to his scooter, climbed on, and gave his watch a quick, anxious glance. He was definitely behind schedule. He lifted the kickstand and gunned the engine, speeding off into the busy traffic. Horns blared around him as he weaved between cars, but Patrior didn't care. He was late for a date, and right after that, he had to get to his daughter's dance recital. These two events were bright spots in what had been a very long, very dark period in his life, and he was determined not to miss a second of either. For Patrior, things hadn't been going well for a very long time. About 8 years earlier, he'd fallen into a deep rut of binge drinking and heavy gambling. It was a destructive cycle that cost him almost everything. One day, while he was drunk, he struck his wife. That was the final straw. She divorced him, and in the process, he lost custody of his beloved daughter, Alabama, who was now 12 years old. After the divorce, Patriar's life continued its downward spiral. He ended up moving in with his elderly mother. His drinking only got worse, and his gambling habit consumed nearly every cent he earned from his janitor job. Things got even more complicated when he started an affair with a married coworker. When her husband discovered the affair, the situation ended in tragedy. The woman died, and her death was ruled an apparent suicide. That had been 5 years ago, and the trauma of it all had left a deep scar on Patrior. He'd barely dated since then. He had pretty much accepted that he was going to be alone for the rest of his life. But then, a few weeks before this day in June, his phone rang. It was the woman he was now racing to meet, a woman named Audrey Liu. He was so late now, he was genuinely worried she wouldn't wait for him. So, he twisted the throttle on his scooter, flying across an intersection and ignoring another chorus of angry horns. He had known Audrey for a long time. They had met right after his divorce and had gone out a few times, but they eventually just lost touch. She was quite a bit younger than him, and back then she had a habit of standing him up. But she was also fun, and it had been ages since Patrior had felt the excitement of a date. So when she called him out of the blue, saying she wanted to see him again, he immediately said yes. They had made plans to meet that afternoon at a park near his hospital. It was a well-known spot, with a big rocky hill rising up behind it. The views from the top were some of the best in the city. On one side, you could see the vast expanse of the ocean, and on the other, dramatic cliffs that were dotted with ancient caves. They wouldn't have much time together, maybe just enough for a short walk before he had to leave for Alabama's recital. But Patrior was hopeful. He hoped that the romantic setting might be enough to spark something between them again. A few minutes later, he pulled up to the park entrance. And to his immense relief, Audrey was still there, waiting for him. He parked his scooter, locked his cell phone away in the underseat compartment, and walked over to her. He could see a nervous smile on her face, and it made him feel like she was just as excited as he was. That gave him a little boost of confidence. He took her hand, and together they started walking down the path. The next morning, around 8 a.m., about 10 miles up the coast from that park, Patrior's older brother, Mark E. Wire, was on the deck of his boat. He was a fisherman, and he was busy pulling a large oyster trap out of the water. As he worked, his phone started ringing. He set down the trap and answered it. Before he could even say hello, he heard his mother's voice, and it was filled with worry. She asked him if he knew where Patrior was. Mark frowned. This was a strange question. Patrior lived with their mother, so she should know his whereabouts better than anyone. But his mother quickly explained that Patrior hadn't come home last night. He also wasn't answering his phone, and he hadn't shown up for his shift at the hospital that morning. But then she mentioned the most concerning thing of all. He had missed his daughter's dance recital the previous evening. This was the detail that made Mark's blood run cold. He knew how much Patrior adored his daughter. He had been talking about that recital for weeks. There was no way he would have missed it willingly. Mark knew then that something was seriously wrong. He promised his mother he'd figure it out. He hung up the phone and immediately started calling Patrior's friends. With each call he made, his worry grew. No one had seen or heard from Patrior since yesterday afternoon. The last anyone knew, he had left work around 4 p.m., but he hadn't told anyone where he was going. Mark felt a knot tightening in his stomach, but he knew he had to start somewhere. Patrior's work seemed like the most logical place. He steered his boat back to the dock, tied it off, jumped in his car, and headed towards the hospital. 4 hours later, Mark was standing on a rocky lookout point, the same one that overlooked the park where Patrior was supposed to have his date. He was scanning the city of Set below him. The hospital where Patrior worked was in the middle of the business district, a busy area full of canals, cafes, and tourist spots. Mark and a few of Patrior's friends had spent the entire morning combing through these places, checking one by one, but they had found no sign of him. So Mark had decided to check the more remote areas around the city, like this hill behind the park. But still, there was nothing. Mark was trying to think of any other place his brother might have gone when his phone rang again. It was one of the friends who was helping with the search. He had just found Patrior's scooter. It was parked outside the entrance to the park at the bottom of the hill, just a short drive from where Mark was standing. Mark told his friend not to touch anything. He sprinted back to his car, sped down the hill, and pulled into the parking lot. And there it was. Patrior's scooter, parked just as his friend had said. Mark stared at the scooter, then at the quiet, empty park surrounding him. A cold, heavy weight settled in his stomach. He couldn't think of a single logical reason why Patrior would have left his scooter here overnight. All day, a nagging fear had been in the back of his mind, a worry that something terrible had happened to his little brother. But now, seeing that scooter, that fear became a certainty. Almost 2 weeks later, at 8 a.m. on the 5th of July 2014, Detective Boris Fryer took an exit ramp towards the French town of Set. The morning sun hit his windshield, and he had to squint as he looked out at the scenery. It was a beautiful place, with long stretches of beaches and canals, all framed by those same rocky cliffs. Fryer was a senior investigator from the nearby city of Montpellier. He had been called in to take over a missing persons case that had the local Set police completely stumped. The case was that of 49-year-old Patrior, who had vanished nearly 2 weeks ago after going on a date with a woman named Audrey Liu. The local police had already spoken to Audrey. She told them she had no idea what happened to Patrior. She said they went for a walk, he escorted her to her bus stop, and then she assumed he just went back to his scooter and went about his evening. But his scooter was found the next day, right where he'd left it, and Patrior was nowhere to be found. Now, 2 weeks had passed, and there was still no sign of him. Patrior's brother Mark had been very involved, trying to help the investigation in any way he could. Fryer had spoken to Mark on the phone, and Mark had painted a picture of his brother as a saint. A man who would drop anything to help a friend, who never got into fights, and who had no enemies to speak of. But Fryer was a seasoned detective, and he was skeptical. In his experience, people who just vanish off the face of the earth are often victims of foul play, either kidnapped or murdered. Of course, he had no concrete reason to suspect that yet. It was just as possible that Patrior had gotten into an accident, maybe fallen off one of the cliffs, or maybe he had chosen to disappear. At this point, what Fryer needed to do was start from scratch. He had to dig into who Patrior really was and figure out if there was a reason someone might want him gone. A few minutes after arriving in Set, Fryer was sitting in the living room of Patrior's ex-wife, a woman named Claude. They both sat down, and Fryer switched on his recording device. He started by asking Claude where she was on the day Patrior went missing. She said it was a completely normal Monday for her. After work, she picked up their daughter, Alabama, from school and drove her to her dance recital. She said she had fully expected to see Patrior there. It had really surprised her when he didn't show up. She told Fryer that despite all of Patrior's flaws, and he had plenty, he was a good father. He wouldn't have missed that recital. At the mention of his flaws, Fryer leaned forward. This was exactly what he needed to know about. He didn't suspect Claude of anything. She had a solid alibi and no real motive. But he thought she might be able to shed some light on any habits or troubles that could have led to Patrior's disappearance. When he asked her about this, Claude hesitated. She said she didn't want to speak ill of him, but she admitted that he drank and gambled far more than he should have. Fryer pressed her for more details, but Claude insisted that Patrior had always kept that part of his life very separate from her and their daughter. But then she paused, thinking for a moment. She said there was someone who might know more. And with that, she called their 12-year-old daughter, Alabama, into the room. The young girl came in, and she was visibly shaken and nervous about everything that was happening with her dad. Her mother, Claude, took her hand gently and encouraged her to tell the detective her story. Slowly, Alabama began to speak. She said that about a week before her dad disappeared, he had taken her on a very strange errand. He had parked outside of a tunnel and told her to wait in the car. Then he got out and walked into the dark tunnel to meet someone. She said it was a man, but it was too dark for her to see his face or any features. But she clearly saw her father hand the man some kind of package. After the exchange, her father turned and ran back to the car. She said he seemed really scared. Afterwards, he refused to tell her who the man was or what the meeting was about. All he would say was that he had done something really stupid, and because of it, he now owed some people a lot of money. After Alabama finished her story, her mother thanked her and sent her back to her room. Once she was gone, Fryer asked Claude if she had any idea who the man in the tunnel could be. Claude said she didn't know. But she did have one name that she thought was worth looking into. She explained that this wasn't someone who would have lent Patrior money. Instead, it was a man who held a deep personal grudge against him. His name was Remy Shen, and he was a local hairstylist. An hour later, Fryer was sitting in a cramped cubicle at the Set police station, scrolling through a file on his laptop. He had run Remy Shen's name through the police database, and just as Claude had suggested, he found an immediate connection to Patrior. Back in 2009, a few years after Patrior's divorce, he had been questioned as a witness in the suicide of Remy Shen's wife, a woman named Nadesh Shen. Nadesh had worked with Patrior at the same hospital. The report stated that Nadesh had come home one night after a work party and confessed to her husband, Remy, that she had been having an affair with Patrior. The couple had a massive argument that lasted for hours. Nadesh ended up sleeping on the couch while Remy went upstairs to their bedroom. The next morning, Remy found Nadesh in their garage. She had hanged herself. As soon as Fryer finished reading the report, he knew he had his first real suspect. He looked up Remy's last known address and phone number. Around 10 a.m. the next day, July 7th, Fryer led Remy Shen into an interrogation room and shut the door. Remy was a short, wiry man. He had a scowl on his face that made it perfectly clear he felt this was a huge inconvenience. Fryer immediately got the sense that Remy was the type of person who would only crack under intense pressure. So he decided to go on the offensive right away. He tried to shake Remy by telling him they knew he was involved in the kidnapping of Patrior. It was a complete bluff. Fryer had no evidence at all. But he wanted to see how Remy would react. To his surprise and frustration, Remy just laughed. He acted like he had no idea who Patrior even was. When Fryer brought up his late wife, Nadesh, and the affair she'd had with Patrior, Remy just scoffed. He reminded the detective that his wife's death had been 5 years ago. He said he had moved on, that he was dating other people. He argued that it was absurd to think he would hold a grudge for 5 years without doing anything, only to suddenly decide to take revenge now, out of the blue. It just didn't make any sense. Fryer wasn't sure what to make of him. Remy seemed incredibly confident, almost too confident. So Fryer changed tactics and simply asked him where he was on June 23rd, the day Patrior went missing. After thinking for a moment, Remy said he had spent the whole afternoon alone cleaning out a storage unit he had rented. It was a terrible alibi, easily faked. But with nothing else to go on, Fryer had no choice but to let Remy go. As he watched Remy walk out, Fryer knew he was running out of time. 2 weeks had already passed. Every day that went by, the chances of finding Patrouar alive grew slimmer. Out of desperation, he decided to go back to the very beginning of the timeline and speak with Audrey Liu one more time. As the last person known to have seen Patrouar, Audrey was an obvious person of interest. The local police had already questioned her, and Fryer had watched the tape of that interview several times. He wasn't sure what more he could possibly get from her, but he knew he had to try. He picked up the phone and asked Audrey to come back to the station. Later that same afternoon, around 2 p.m., Fryer had been across from Audrey in the same interrogation room. He started the recorder and asked her to go over her history with Patrouar again. At first, her story was exactly the same as it had been on the tape. She said they met 8 years ago in 2006, dated for a little while, and then lost contact. A few weeks ago, she said, she happened to walk past the bar where they had their first date, and it made her think of him. So, she called him up, and they made plans to meet. She described their date as a short walk in the park. Afterwards, Patrouar walked her to the bus stop, and she assumed he went back to his scooter to head to his daughter's recital. That's when Fryer interrupted her. He asked her to tell him, specifically, which direction Patrouar had headed in after he left her at the bus stop. Audrey just sat there for a long moment. Then she said, I can't remember. This answer really bothered Fryer. Here was the one person who should have been able to give him the most information about Patrouar's final moments, and she was offering nothing useful. So Fryer dropped his polite tone and went after her hard. He told her he wasn't buying her story. He said she needed to tell him everything she knew right now, or things were going to get much worse for her. Audrey's eyes went wide. Her voice started to shake as she insisted she had already told him everything. But Fryer didn't let up. He kept pushing, demanding that she admit what she had done, until he was practically shouting. Audrey broke down in tears, repeating over and over that Patrouar was fine when she left him, she just couldn't remember all the little details. Finally, Fryer backed off. He had conducted countless interrogations in his career, and his gut was telling him that Audrey's fragile state wasn't an act. He had pushed her as hard as he could, and he had to consider the possibility that she was simply telling the truth. A little while later, after Audrey had left, Fryer sat alone in the interrogation room, thinking. He hadn't ruled out any of his suspects. He still had no idea who the mysterious man in the tunnel was. And on top of all that, there was still a chance that no crime had even been committed. They didn't have a body. For all he knew, Patrouar could have just walked away from his life. There were just too many unknowns. Fryer knew that if this case was ever going to move forward, they needed to find Patrouar, dead or alive. Around 11 a.m. on July 17th, 3.5 weeks after Patrouar disappeared, Detective Fryer parked his car on the shoulder of a winding road in Set. He got out, ducked under a line of yellow police tape, and walked across a long stretch of dry grass that led up to a sheer cliff wall. About a dozen yards ahead, he could see the dark, round opening of a cave, barely visible against the rock face. A few hours earlier, a group of teenagers had walked into the police station. They seemed very shaken up. They said they had found a human body inside that cave. As soon as Fryer heard this, he rushed to the scene. The cave was less than half a mile from where Patrouar's scooter had been found. Fryer switched on his flashlight and stepped inside the cave. A forensics team followed close behind him. Together, they made their way into the darkness. The flashlight beam revealed walls covered in graffiti, and the floor was littered with empty bottles and trash. It looked like a popular hangout spot for local kids. As they moved deeper, the main cave split off into a maze of narrow tunnels. Fryer was just about to tell his team to spread out and search each one when he passed a tunnel that had a foul, overpowering smell coming from it. He stopped and aimed his flashlight down that specific tunnel. He saw a shallow pit that had been dug into the floor. And lying at the bottom of the pit was what looked like a ragged lump of black fabric. But as Fryer stepped closer, he knew it wasn't fabric. The smell was overwhelming now. He was standing over the charred remains of a human body. He knelt down to get a closer look and immediately saw what appeared to be a bullet hole in the skull and another in the torso. These details, one shot to the head, one to the stomach, and the body being burned afterwards to destroy evidence, felt disturbingly familiar to Fryer. It looked like a professional, mob-style hit. A year and a half later, just before Christmas of 2015, Detective Fryer was in his office in Montpellier when his phone rang. It was Mark, Patrioir's older brother, calling again to ask for an update on the case. Fryer sighed. The truth was, he had nothing new to tell him. The body in the cave had been confirmed through DNA to be Patrioir. Fryer had hoped that finding the body would open up new leads, but it hadn't. They had scoured the cave for clues, tested cigarette butts found at the scene for DNA, and re-interviewed the teenagers who found the body, but the case had hit a complete dead end. The execution-style killing did fit with the theory that Patrioir had been killed over a gambling debt. But Fryer had never been able to find any evidence that Patrioir owed anyone that kind of money. He also still hadn't identified the man in the tunnel that Alabama had seen. That left Remy Shen and Audrey Liu as his only two suspects. Fryer had placed both of them under surveillance, but so far neither had done anything suspicious. The investigation was completely stalled. Fryer understood that Patrioir's family was losing patience. So he wasn't surprised when he told Mark there were no new developments, and Mark just snapped. He told Fryer that if the police weren't going to solve this, he would take matters into his own hands. 3 months later, on a night in March of 2016, Detective Fryer sat down on his couch to watch television. Mark had followed through on his threat. He had convinced the producers of a national true crime show to do an episode on his brother's case, and it was airing tonight. As the show began, Fryer felt a knot of anxiety in his stomach. Mark knew details about the investigation that were not public knowledge. If he shared them on national television, it could seriously compromise the entire case. But a part of him was also curious, and he hoped that maybe, just maybe, renewed public attention could help. As he watched, Fryer was relieved. Mark wasn't there to talk about the specifics of the investigation. He was there to talk about his brother. He described Patrioir as a hard-working father who had just never been able to catch a break. A man who, at the very least, deserved justice. At the end of his segment, Mark made a simple, heartfelt plea for anyone with any information to please come forward. When the show ended, Fryer didn't feel worried anymore. Nothing sensitive had been revealed. But he also didn't feel very hopeful. He thought the chances of anything coming from this were incredibly small. He was wrong. The next morning, his phone would ring. And an hour after that call, Fryer was ringing the doorbell of an apartment in Lunel, a town not far from Set. A woman answered the door. When Fryer showed her his badge, she let him inside. The woman's name was Sophie. She had called the police after watching the true crime show, saying she had information about Patrioir's case. Fryer followed her into her kitchen, sat down at her table, turned on his recorder, and told her to start from the beginning. And as her story unfolded, Fryer knew the case was finally solved. Based on all the evidence and witness testimony, police were able to reconstruct what they believed truly happened to Patrioir Iwire on the afternoon of Monday, the 23rd of June 2014. At 4:30 p.m., the killer stood on that rocky hill overlooking the park in Set. They were watching through a pair of binoculars as Patrioir and Audrey walked hand in hand down the path below. The couple was taking their time, enjoying the beautiful scenery and each other's company. At some point, Audrey stopped and pointed across the road towards the entrance of one of the caves in the nearby cliffs. When the killer saw this, their heart began to race. They watched as the couple crossed the road, walked up to the cave, and disappeared inside. The killer lowered the binoculars and placed them in a large duffel bag they were carrying. They slung the bag over their shoulder, hurried down the hill, and went straight to the cave entrance. When they got there, they put the bag on the ground and unzipped it. They pulled out a large rifle, a roll of duct tape, and a plain white mask. The killer put on the mask. With the rifle in one hand and the tape in the other, they entered the cave. They could hear Patriar and Audrey's voices inside. They hadn't gone very far in. They were so wrapped up in their date that they had no idea someone else was there. But as the killer got closer, the couple heard the footsteps and turned around. When Audrey saw the masked figure with the rifle, she started to scream. Patriar's face went pale. Before they could do anything, the killer threw the roll of duct tape at Audrey and told her that if she wanted to live, she would do exactly as she was told. The killer ordered Audrey to use the tape to bind Patriar's wrists and ankles. For a moment, Audrey just stood there, completely frozen in shock. But then, she complied. As she taped Patriar's hands and feet, he just stood there, silently, in stunned disbelief. When she was finished, the killer told her to get out of the cave and not to say a word to anyone about what just happened. She hesitated for a second, glancing back at Patriar, but then she turned and ran. Once her footsteps had faded, it was just the killer and Patriar alone in the cave. Patriar stared at the masked figure, wondering what was about to happen. The killer made intense eye contact with him, raised the rifle, and shot him once in the head and once in the chest. Patriar crumpled to the ground. The killer then slung the rifle over their shoulder, grabbed Patriar by the ankles, and dragged his body down one of the narrow tunnels, dumping him in that shallow pit. Then, they took out a canister of lighter fluid they had brought in the bag and doused the body. They lit a match and tossed it into the pit. As Patriar's body began to burn, the killer walked out of the cave. As soon as they were back in the daylight, they pulled off their mask. There was only one thing left to do now: find Audrey, explain everything, and make sure she didn't go to the police. Because the killer was Remy Shen, the hairstylist who had hated Patriar for 5 years for the affair with his late wife. And he had just tricked Audrey into helping him commit murder. It turned out that Audrey was actually Remy's ex-girlfriend. They had started dating in 2009, shortly after his wife's death. Remy had realized that because Audrey also had a history with Patriar, he could use her to lure Patriar into a trap and finally get his revenge. But Audrey was not a willing accomplice to murder. She claims she didn't know Remy was going to kill Patriar. Remy had fed her a sob story, telling her that Patriar owed him a lot of money. She believed they were just going to scare Patriar into paying it back. It wasn't until they were in the cave and Remy showed up with a mask and a rifle that she realized his intentions were far more sinister. After the murder, Remy kept Audrey silent by threatening to kill her and her children if she ever told anyone. For over a year, she kept his horrific secret, lying to the police the entire time. But when she saw that true crime episode and heard Mark's desperate plea for information, she finally cracked. She confessed everything to her friend Sophie, who she was watching the show with. And Sophie did the right thing. She called the police the very next day. On the 31st of March 2016, Remy Shen and Audrey Liu were arrested for their roles in the death of Patriar. Remy received a sentence of 30 years in prison for murder. Audrey was sentenced to 12 years for being an accessory to the kidnapping. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya! Imagine driving down a dark, heavily forested highway on a cold winter night, surrounded by nothing but towering trees and the faint glow of your own headlights. That was the reality for dozens of commuters traveling on the A3 highway in Surrey, England, on the evening of December 11, 2002. Surrey is known for being one of the most heavily wooded counties in all of Great Britain, and at night, the thick forests on either side of the asphalt can feel incredibly claustrophobic. Around 7:20 p.m. on this particular night, the peace of that drive was completely shattered. The local police department began receiving a flood of frantic emergency calls from drivers on the highway. The callers were all describing the exact same terrifying scene. They said there was a motorist driving with absolute madness on the road. This driver had their high beams on, completely blinding anyone in front of them, and they were weaving wildly in and out of the heavy traffic. The car was traveling at an incredibly high speed, tailgating people and nearly causing multiple pileups. And then, just a few minutes later, several of the callers reported something even more horrifying. They had actually watched this reckless car veer completely off the asphalt, hurtle down the steep, grassy embankment on the side of the highway, and plunge directly into the thick, dark tree line. To the callers, it looked like a catastrophic high-speed crash, and they were certain that whoever was inside that vehicle was either severely injured or dead. And so, the police department immediately dispatched a couple of officers to the scene to investigate. When the two officers arrived at the stretch of the A3 where the callers had reported the crash, they turned on their spotlight and began driving slowly along the shoulder. But the problem was, they couldn't see anything. There were no tire tracks in the grass, no broken branches on the trees, no debris on the ground, and no smoke rising from the forest. It was just a quiet, dark stretch of highway with normal traffic passing by. They drove up and down the road several times, shining their lights into the darkness, but there was absolutely no sign of an accident. At this point, if only one person had called, the officers would have assumed it was a mistake or a prank. But because so many different drivers had called in to report the exact same thing at the exact same time, the officers knew they couldn't just give up and go back to the station. They decided to park their patrol car on the shoulder, get out, and continue their search on foot. They turned on their high-powered flashlights and began walking along the edge of the dense forest, shining their lights directly into the thick brush. The woods were incredibly dense, and the winter darkness seemed to swallow the light from their torches. They walked for quite a while, their boots crunching on the frozen grass, searching for any indication that a vehicle had crashed into the trees. And then, after walking a significant distance, one of the officers stopped. His flashlight had caught a tiny glint of something reflective deep in the woods. It looked like a piece of plastic or metal, which was completely out of place among the dirt and tree trunks. The two officers stepped off the shoulder, slid down the steep embankment, and pushed their way into the thick, overgrown tree line. As they got closer, they realized they had indeed found a car. It was a heavily damaged hatchback, completely wedged between two large oak trees and covered in dirt, dead leaves, and branches. It was totally invisible from the road. The officers immediately called for backup and ran toward the vehicle, preparing themselves to find a badly injured driver. They looked through the shattered glass of the driver's side window, but to their surprise, the driver's seat was completely empty. They walked around to the other side of the vehicle and saw that the front passenger door was swung wide open. And there, lying on the ground just outside the open door, was a body. But when the officers shone their flashlights onto the body, they froze in complete disbelief. What they were looking at made absolutely no sense at all. To understand why these officers were so completely caught off guard, we have to go back 5 months in time, to the night of July 16th, 2002. On that warm summer night, a 21-year-old man named Christopher Brian Chandler was sitting in a pub in West London, finishing up a beer. This pub was located about an hour north of that stretch of the A3 highway in Surrey, where the crashed car had just been found. Christopher was at the pub with a close friend, and it was supposed to be a fun night out. But as the hours passed, Christopher began to feel incredibly anxious. He couldn't sit still, and he kept staring nervously at the door. It turns out Christopher was actually a wanted man. The police in London were actively searching for him in connection with a robbery, and because of this, Christopher hated staying in one place for too long. He was terrified that the authorities would walk through the door at any second. He was being so secretive that the only people who even knew his whereabouts that night were the friend sitting across from him and his brother, whom Christopher had called earlier in the evening. Eventually, the paranoia became too much for Christopher to handle. He told his friend that he had to leave immediately. He said goodbye, walked out of the pub, got into his car, and began driving south. But Christopher never arrived at his destination. He simply disappeared, and nobody heard from him again. Christopher's brother eventually went to the police and reported him missing. But the problem was, the brother knew Christopher was wanted for robbery, so he assumed Christopher had just gone on the run to escape the law. The police felt the exact same way. They figured Christopher was actively trying to elude them, so they didn't put much effort into searching for him. The missing person report was filed away, and everybody just moved on. Fast forward to 5 months later, on December 11th, when those frantic drivers called the police about the reckless car crashing into the woods. When the two officers stood over the body they had found in the forest, they realized they were looking at Christopher's car. But when they looked down at the body lying next to the open passenger door, they saw that it was not a fresh casualty of a recent crash. It was almost entirely a skeleton. The flesh had completely decayed, the clothes were weathered, and it was obvious that this person had been dead for months. The forensic investigators who arrived at the scene would later confirm that the skeletal remains did indeed belong to Christopher Brian Chandler. They estimated that he had died on the very night he disappeared 5 months earlier on July 16th. This meant that Christopher had crashed his car and died in those woods in the middle of summer. But this realization created a mind-bending paradox. If Christopher had been dead in those woods for 5 months, who was driving the car that dozens of motorists saw tearing down the A3 that very night? Who was the reckless driver who veered off the road and crashed into the embankment at 7:20 p.m. on December 11th? The Surrey police tried to explain this by saying it was all just one massive, unbelievable coincidence. Their official theory was that there actually was a reckless driver on the highway that night, but that driver had somehow managed to recover from their near crash, pull back onto the road, and drive away undetected. And then, by sheer luck, when the police went searching that specific area of the woods, they just happened to stumble upon Christopher's 5-month-old crash site. But the problem was, several of the callers had been very specific. They didn't just see a car drive erratically, they watched it go over the embankment and crash into the trees in real time. And when the police searched that exact spot, they found Christopher's car, which had all the hallmarks of a fresh, violent impact, yet the driver had been dead for half a year. To this day, there is no logical explanation for how those drivers witnessed a crash happening in real time that had actually occurred 5 months in the past. It remains one of England's most famous and haunting mysteries, known to the public as the A3 ghost crash. Now, our next story takes us to northern France, to a quiet, picturesque little village where life moved at a very slow and peaceful pace. On the morning of August 2nd, 2017, two men were sitting together inside a local bar, laughing, drinking, and talking. These two men were Lucien Perrault and Olivier Boudin. Even though there was a massive age difference between them, with Lucien being 69 years old and Olivier being 38, the two were absolutely inseparable. The locals in the village actually referred to them as father and son because they were always together, looking out for one another. Lucien had spent his entire life working hard in a manufacturing plant in a nearby city, but just 4 years earlier, he had finally retired and moved into a small house in this quiet village. But when he first moved in, he was incredibly lonely and depressed. Lucien was divorced, he struggled heavily with alcohol, and he felt like he had nothing left to look forward to in life. But then he met Olivier, and everything changed. When they first met, Olivier was also going through a very difficult time. He was dealing with some chronic health issues that made it hard for him to maintain steady work, and he was constantly bouncing between the nearby city and the village, trying to find his footing. When these two men connected, they instantly bonded over their shared struggles. For Lucien, what really mattered was that Olivier, despite being so much younger, never treated him like a useless old man. He treated Lucien like a true peer and a best friend. Before long, their lives became completely intertwined. They created a daily routine of meeting up, walking through the village, and helping each other out, which gave both of them a brand new sense of purpose and joy. On this particular morning, as they sat in the local bar, they began talking about what they wanted to do that night. They decided they would have a nice summer barbecue at Lucian's house. Lucian would grill up some beautiful beef ribs, and they would sit out on his back garden patio, drink some wine, and spend the evening enjoying the warm summer air. It sounded like a wonderful, simple plan. In fact, the bartender would later recall overhearing their conversation and remembering just how incredibly excited both men seemed about their upcoming cookout. And so, that evening, Olivier and Lucian arrived at Lucian's house and headed out to the backyard patio. Lucian had gone to the trouble of setting up a lovely scene. He had placed a small round table on the patio and covered it with a classic red and white checkered tablecloth. On the table, he set out an open bottle of wine, some fresh cheese, and a baguette. Olivier sat down at the table, pouring them some wine and enjoying the food, while Lucian walked over to the grill to start cooking up the beef ribs. Now, Lucian had a neighbor who lived very close by, whom we will call Marie. Marie's second-floor bedroom window directly overlooked Lucian's backyard patio. That night, as the sun began to set, Marie happened to glance out her window and saw the two men. They were playing music, laughing, and goofing around, having a great time. Marie was very used to seeing them spend time together, and she knew they often stayed up late, drinking and talking. She didn't want to be a nosy neighbor, so she simply closed her window to block out the noise, went to bed, and fell asleep to the distant sound of their music and laughter. The next morning, around 6 a.m., Marie woke up and looked out her window once again. She glanced down into Lucian's yard, and what she saw didn't surprise her at all. Lucian was still sitting perfectly upright at the round table, looking as though he might be eating or drinking. Olivier, however, was lying flat on his back on the ground next to the table, completely passed out. Marie chuckled to herself, thinking that the two men had clearly stayed up all night drinking, and Olivier had simply fallen asleep on the grass. She didn't want to judge them, so she decided to mind her own business and went about her morning. A few hours later, around 9 a.m., Marie left her house to go to another neighbor's property to feed their chickens while they were away for the day. As she walked past Lucian's yard, she glanced through the fence and saw that the scene had not changed at all. Lucian was still sitting at the table in the exact same position, and Olivier was still lying motionless on the grass. Marie started to feel a small twinge of concern, but she figured they were just sleeping off an incredibly heavy hangover, so she kept going, fed the chickens, and spent the morning doing her chores. But when Marie returned to her house around noon, she looked into the yard again, and this time she was genuinely alarmed. The sun was now high in the sky, and the summer heat was becoming intense. Yet, Lucian and Olivier had still not moved a single fraction of an inch. Lucian was still slumped at the table, and Olivier was still spread out on the grass. Marie realized that even if they were severely intoxicated, the blistering heat of the midday sun would have forced them to wake up by now. They were going to get severe heat stroke if they stayed out there any longer. And then Marie walked up to the edge of the yard and began shouting their names, trying to get them to wake up. But she got absolutely no response. Realizing that something was terribly wrong, Marie panicked. She ran to a nearby neighbor's house, told them what was happening, and together they grabbed several large pots of cold water. They ran back into Lucian's yard and threw the water over both men, hoping the sudden shock would wake them up from their drunken stupor. But when the cold water hit them, neither man flinched. They didn't move at all. Marie reached out and touched Lucian's arm, and she immediately realized they were cold. They were both dead. The next day, the local prosecutor made a public announcement stating that they were launching a full criminal investigation into the two men's deaths, which were being treated as highly suspicious. The prosecutor explained that it appeared Lucian and Olivier had died at the exact same time, leading investigators to believe this was either a double homicide or a tragic murder-suicide. The primary theory was that someone had put a deadly poison in their food or wine. The police began searching the patio for evidence. They found a can of beans that the men had been eating, along with the remains of the beef, the bread, and the wine. They immediately shipped the canned beans to a highly specialized medical institute in Paris to test for botulism, which is a rare and extremely lethal toxin that can grow inside improperly sealed canned goods. But a few days later, the results came back completely negative. There was no botulism. The police then sent the rest of the food and the wine to several other forensic laboratories to be tested for a wide range of chemical poisons, heavy metals, and toxic substances. But once again, every single test came back completely clear. There was absolutely nothing toxic in anything they had consumed. The investigators were completely baffled. There were no signs of a struggle, no physical injuries on either body, and no trace of poison. How could two best friends suddenly drop dead at the exact same moment in the middle of a peaceful backyard barbecue? But then the official autopsies were completed, and the forensic pathologists discovered a series of events so incredibly tragic and bizarre that no one could have ever predicted them. It turned out that Lucien and Olivier were not murdered, nor was it a suicide. They had died due to an almost impossible combination of minor, non-fatal medical issues that collided in the worst possible way at the exact same moment. The autopsies revealed that Lucien had very poor dental health and was missing a large number of his teeth. Olivier, on the other hand, suffered from a condition called cardiomegaly, which meant his heart was slightly enlarged and fragile. While this condition was being monitored by doctors and was fully under control, it made his heart highly sensitive to sudden, extreme stress. On the night of August 2nd, these minor medical issues became a recipe for disaster. Lucien had grilled up a plate of tough beef ribs. Because he was missing so many teeth, he had a very hard time chewing the meat, but he was enjoying the food and the company so much that he was wolfing it down very quickly. At some point during the meal, Lucien swallowed a massive, unchewed chunk of the tough beef rib. The meat got securely lodged in his throat, completely blocking his airway. Lucien began to desperately choke, turning blue and gasping for air. Sitting right across from him, Olivier watched his best friend and father figure suddenly start dying in front of him. Olivier was immediately seized with an overwhelming wave of panic and terror. He jumped up from his chair, his adrenaline spiking as he prepared to run to his friend's aid. But the sheer shock, terror, and physical exertion of that sudden, high-stress moment was too much for Olivier's fragile, enlarged heart. The intense stress caused his heart to instantly seize up. He suffered a massive fatal heart attack and collapsed dead onto the grass. Meanwhile, Lucien was still choking. With Olivier now lying dead on the ground, Lucien had absolutely no one left to perform the Heimlich maneuver or help him clear his airway. He remained slumped over the table, desperately struggling to breathe, until he finally suffocated and died right there in his chair. The next morning, when Marie looked out her window, she wasn't looking at two hungover friends sleeping off a wild night of drinking. She was looking at the silent, tragic scene of an unbelievable double tragedy. The two inseparable friends who had brought so much joy and meaning back into each other's lives had been taken away in a matter of minutes by a cruel, freak sequence of events. Our third story takes us to the vast, beautiful, and incredibly treacherous waters off the northeastern coast of Australia. It was a little after 7 a.m. on the morning of April 15th, 2007, when three close friends launched a beautiful 35-foot white catamaran called the Kaz 2 from a local marina. They were setting off on what they all believed would be the ultimate adventure of their lives. The captain of the Kaz 2 was 56-year-old Des Batten. Des was a highly experienced, deeply responsible sailor who had spent months meticulously planning every single aspect of this journey. The two friends he was bringing along with him were Jim Tunstead, who was 63 years old, and Jim's older brother, Peter Tunstead, who was 69. These three men were not reckless risk-takers. They were stable, devoted family men who had all been happily married to their wives for over 30 years. Des had 2 children, Jim had 4, and Peter had 5. They were all either fully retired or right on the verge of retirement, and this voyage was meant to be a grand celebration of their hard work and the beginning of a peaceful new chapter in their lives. Their planned route was incredibly ambitious. They were going to sail the Cas2 from the northeastern side of Australia, travel all the way up and around the northern coast of the continent, and then head down the western coast to their final destination of Perth, where they all lived. The entire trip was scheduled to take about 8 weeks. The men were absolutely giddy with excitement at the prospect of spending 2 full months out on the open water, fishing, drinking cold beers, and enjoying each other's company. They had spent a lot of time and money preparing the boat to ensure it was completely safe and seaworthy. Shortly after they launched the boat on April 15th, Peter's wife called his cell phone to see how the departure had gone. When Peter answered, she could immediately hear the immense joy in his voice. In the background, she could hear Des and Jim laughing and joking around, clearly having the time of their lives. Peter told his wife that the weather was absolutely gorgeous, the water was as calm as glass, and they were about to set up their fishing rods and crack open some beers. It sounded like the absolute perfect start to their dream trip. Peter told his wife that he loved her, promised to keep her updated, and then they hung up the phone. Now, because Des was a highly experienced sailor and a member of a volunteer marine rescue group, he was absolutely obsessed with safety. He knew how quickly the ocean could turn deadly. Before they even set foot on the boat for the trip, Des made Jim and Peter go through multiple rigorous man-overboard drills on the Cas2. He wanted to make absolutely certain that if anyone fell into the water, the remaining crew members would know exactly how to operate the life-saving equipment and pull them back on board safely. They practiced these drills until they were completely second nature. Furthermore, when they charted their course, Des established a very strict rule. They would always sail close to the shoreline. They would never venture out into the deep, unpredictable open ocean because staying close to the coast meant they would always be within reach of help if an emergency arose. To document their journey, Jim had brought along a video camera, and around 10 a.m. on that first morning, he turned it on and began filming. In the video, which would later be recovered, the men look completely happy and relaxed. Des is at the helm, smiling warmly, while Peter sits nearby. In the background of the video, the Australian coastline is clearly visible, proving that they were strictly adhering to Des's safety rule of staying close to the shore. But just a few hours after Jim stopped recording that video, things began to take an incredibly strange turn. A woman named Isabel Wheeler, who did not know the three men and had never seen the Cas2 before, was fishing from the shore in an area called Champagne Bay. As she looked out over the water, she spotted a beautiful white 35-foot catamaran sailing from east to west along the horizon. She watched it for a little while, but then she saw the boat make a sudden, sharp 90-degree turn. Instead of continuing along the safe, planned route near the coast, the catamaran began sailing directly out towards the deep, open ocean, away from the safety of the land. Isabel didn't think much of it at the time, as she had no idea about the men's strict safety rules, so she just went back to fishing. But the problem was, the very next day, April 16th, two other independent witnesses, who also didn't know the crew, were looking out over the water near Champagne Bay. Quite incredibly, they both spotted the Cas2 sailing from east to west in the exact same spot where Isabel had seen it the day before. Now, this made absolutely no sense. The Cas2 was on a strict point-to-point journey to Perth. There was absolutely no reason for them to double back and spend 24 hours sailing in circles in the exact same bay. But the witnesses were certain of what they saw. And then, on the following day, April 17th, a group of local fishermen were working in the waters farther north of Champagne Bay. They saw the Kaz-2 navigating its way incredibly close to the shore, but the fishermen were deeply concerned because the area the catamaran was sailing through was a notorious, highly dangerous coral reef system. One wrong move could easily rip the bottom of the boat open. Furthermore, the fishermen noticed that the boat's massive sails were completely torn to shreds, flapping wildly in the wind. However, as they watched the boat, they saw a Mei standing at the helm, calmly steering the vessel through the dangerous reefs. The pilot looked so completely in control of the boat that the fishermen assumed he knew exactly what he was doing, so they decided not to intervene or report it. Then came April 18th. A Coast Watch surveillance helicopter was flying its routine patrol over the Great Barrier Reef when the crew looked down and spotted the Kaz-2. The helicopter crew immediately noticed that the catamaran's sails were badly damaged and the boat was navigating through some very treacherous, shallow waters. The helicopter crew tried to contact the Kaz-2 over the marine radio, calling them multiple times to ask if they needed assistance. But there was only silence on the radio. No one answered. The helicopter crew watched the boat through binoculars. They could see a figure at the helm, steering the boat expertly between the coral reefs. Because the pilot seemed to have the situation under control, and because they didn't see any obvious signs of distress, the helicopter crew decided not to initiate a full-scale rescue. However, they did feel that the situation was strange enough to warrant a check, so they contacted the marine police and gave them the boat's coordinates, suggesting they send a patrol boat out to make contact. But when the marine police finally reached the designated area, the Kaz-2 was gone. The police immediately began looking into the boat's registration and contacted the families of Des, Jim, and Peter. The families were frantic. They told the police that except for the brief phone call Peter had made to his wife on the morning of April 15th, not a single one of them had heard from the men. They had gone completely silent. They hadn't answered any phone calls, and they hadn't checked in as planned. At this point, the authorities realized they were dealing with a major emergency. A massive air and sea search was launched, utilizing multiple planes, helicopters, and boats to scan the vast ocean. 2 days later, on April 20th, a search helicopter spotted the Kaz-2 floating about 80 miles off the northeastern coast of Australia. The boat's tattered sails were flapping in the wind, and it was drifting listlessly, spinning slowly in circles. From the air, the rescue crew could see that the deck of the catamaran was completely empty. The searchers had no idea what they were dealing with. It was entirely possible that the boat had been boarded by pirates or smugglers, and that Des, Jim, and Peter were being held hostage down below. Or perhaps the men had been killed and the perpetrators were still hiding inside the cabin, waiting to ambush anyone who approached. Despite the immense danger, a brave rescue officer named Corey Benson volunteered to board the vessel. Corey was lowered from the helicopter into the ocean. He swam through the choppy water, reached the side of the drifting catamaran, and climbed up the ladder onto the deck. The moment his boots hit the wood, he was struck by how eerily quiet it was. There was no sound except for the wind and the tattered sails flapping. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, and no damage to the boat's hull. Corey began to slowly search the deck. As he walked, he started finding clues that indicated the crew had been active just minutes before. He found a fishing rod cast out into the water, securely locked into its holder on the side of the boat, as if someone had been waiting for a bite. On a small outdoor table, there was a blue mug filled with coffee, sitting there undisturbed. On a deck chair, a t-shirt was neatly folded with a pair of reading glasses resting on top of it. Everything looked completely normal, as if the men had just stepped away for a brief moment. Corey walked to the helm and found that the boat's GPS was fully functional and the engine was actually still running, idling quietly. Corey reached over and turned the key, shutting the engine down. Now Corey had to face the most terrifying part of his mission, searching the cabin below. He knew that if there were hostile hijackers on board, they would be waiting for him down there. He drew a deep breath, walked down the short flight of stairs, and opened the door to the cabin. He stepped into a small, neat, common area that served as a kitchen and living space. On the table, he saw a newspaper dated April 15th, the day the men had set sail. On the wall, a calendar had days crossed off up until April 14th, but April 15th was untouched. On another table, a laptop computer was open, plugged in, and fully powered on, showing a screen that looked like someone had just been using it. Nearby, there were plates of food set out, looking relatively fresh, as if a meal had just been prepared and was about to be eaten. Corey looked into the sleeping quarters and saw that the beds had been slept in, and the men's personal belongings, including their wallets, cash, identification, and life jackets, were all sitting exactly where they should be. But Des, Jim, and Peter were nowhere to be found. They had completely vanished from the face of the earth, leaving behind a perfectly functional boat with a running engine, food on the table, and all of their safety gear untouched. A massive investigation was launched to try and piece together what had happened on the Kaz-2. But the deeper the investigators dug, the more confusing the mystery became. Why had the boat been seen turning out toward the open ocean, directly violating the captain's strict safety rules? Why had it been seen doubling back and sailing in circles in Champagne Bay for 24 hours? Who was the mysterious figure that multiple witnesses and the helicopter crew saw standing at the helm, calmly steering the boat through dangerous coral reefs with tattered sails? The official coroner's inquest would eventually propose a theory. They suggested that on the afternoon of April 15th, one of the men had gone to the edge of the boat to try and free a tangled fishing line or retrieve a dropped item. He had lost his balance and fallen into the ocean. The second man, seeing his friend in the water, had rushed to help him, but had also fallen overboard. The third man, panic-stricken, would have tried to steer the boat back to save them, but in his haste, he too fell into the water, leaving the catamaran to drift away on its own, while the three men tragically drowned in the ocean. But this theory had massive holes. If the men had all fallen overboard on the very first day, April 15th, then who was the pilot that multiple independent witnesses and a professional helicopter crew saw steering the boat on April 16th, 17th, and 18th? Why were the sails ripped to shreds if the boat had just been drifting? And why was the engine still running and the coffee still fresh when Corey Benson boarded the boat on April 20th? To this day, the families of Des, Jim, and Peter have never received any real answers. The three men, and whatever truly happened to them out on the water, remain lost to the sea, leaving behind one of the most baffling maritime mysteries in modern history. We have to look closely at how the initial investigations into these cases unfolded, because the details are where the truth always hides. In the case of the A3 ghost crash, the Surrey police were faced with an absolute impossibility. When they first processed the scene, they found that the registration of the car matched a 1994 Vauxhall Astra. This was a car that had been registered to Christopher Brian Chandler, who had been missing since July. The area where the car was found was a steep decline, about 20 yards off the main road, completely enveloped by dense underbrush, nettles, and mature trees. It was a location that was completely invisible to any passing vehicle, even during the bright daylight hours. And so, when the police department first received those calls on December 11th, they were expecting to find a fresh accident scene. The callers had been incredibly descriptive. One caller, a truck driver who had been traveling south on the A3, told the dispatchers that he had seen a dark hatchback lose control, slide sideways down the embankment, and disappear into the trees with its headlights still shining brightly. Another caller, a woman driving a sedan, reported that she had to swerve to avoid the same erratic vehicle just seconds before it left the road. She described the sound of the tires screeching and the violent impact as the car hit the tree line. But the problem was, when the officers actually reached the vehicle on foot, they found a scene that had been undisturbed for months. The car's battery was completely dead, and the engine block was cold and rusted. The tires were deflated, and thick vines had grown up through the wheel wells, wrapping themselves around the axles. Silt and dead leaves had accumulated on the hood and roof, forming a layer of organic debris that had clearly taken months to build up. The interior of the car was damp and covered in mold. There was absolutely no way that this vehicle had been driven on the highway that night, let alone crashed just minutes before the police arrived. At this point, the investigators were forced to look at the skeletal remains on the ground. The body was lying outside the open passenger door, partially covered by leaves and dirt that had naturally fallen over the preceding months. The forensic pathologist who examined the remains noted that there were no signs of trauma inflicted by another person. The bones showed fractures that were completely consistent with a high-speed vehicle impact, including broken ribs and a fractured collarbone. The decay of the soft tissue was extensive, indicating that the body had been exposed to the elements, insects, and small animals for approximately 5 months. This timeline matched perfectly with the date of Christopher's disappearance on July 16th. It turns out the police's initial theory that Christopher had gone on the run to escape his robbery charge was technically correct in terms of his motivation, but tragically wrong in terms of his fate. Christopher had indeed been trying to flee the area, but his escape was cut short on that very first night. He had been driving down the A3 in the middle of the night, likely speeding and paranoid that he was being followed, when he lost control of his vehicle and crashed into the dense woods. The impact had likely thrown him toward the passenger side, or he had managed to crawl out of the open door in a desperate attempt to find help before collapsing and dying in the dark forest. Because the woods were so dense, his car and his body remained hidden just yards from one of the busiest highways in England, completely unnoticed by the thousands of drivers who passed by every single day. But the problem was, this did not explain the calls on December 11th. The Surrey police maintained that the reports of a reckless driver and a crash that night were simply a bizarre coincidence. They argued that a different, unidentified vehicle must have been driving erratically on the highway, veered off the road, and then somehow recovered and drove away, leaving no tracks behind. But the callers had been very specific about the exact location of the crash. They had pointed the police directly to the spot where Christopher's car had been sitting for 5 months. It was almost as if a spectral reenactment of the crash had occurred, a phantom event that forced the authorities to finally look into the woods and find the young man who had been missing for half a year, allowing his family to finally have some closure. When we look at the tragedy in northern France, we see a similarly baffling sequence of events that initially pointed toward a terrible crime. On the afternoon of August 3rd, 2017, the small village was completely cordoned off by the local gendarmerie. The news that Lucien Perrault and Olivier Boudin had been found dead on the patio had sent shockwaves through the community. Because they were so well liked and had no known enemies, the villagers could not comprehend what had happened. The initial investigation focused heavily on the physical evidence found on the red and white checkered tablecloth. The police found the open bottle of red wine, which was half empty, 2 glasses, a partially eaten baguette, a plate of local cheese, and the remains of the grilled beef ribs. There was also a can of white beans that had been opened and partially consumed. Because there were no visible signs of violence on either Lucien or Olivier, the detectives immediately suspected that the men had been poisoned. And so, the police collected all the foodstuffs from the table and sent them under tight security to the forensic laboratories in Paris. The primary suspect was botulism, a highly potent neurotoxin produced by the bacterium Clostridium botulinum, which can thrive in improperly preserved or expired canned goods. If a person consumes food contaminated with botulism, the toxin quickly attacks their nervous system, causing paralysis, respiratory failure, and death within a very short period of time. Because the men had been eating canned beans, this seemed like the most logical explanation for their simultaneous deaths. But the problem was, the laboratory analysis came back completely negative for botulism. The scientists also tested the wine, the cheese, the baguette, and the beef for other common poisons, such as arsenic, cyanide, strychnine, and modern pesticides. Again, every single test was negative. The food was perfectly safe to eat, and the wine was completely untainted. There was no chemical explanation for why these two men had died. At this point, the investigators were forced to wait for the results of the autopsies, which were performed at the Forensic Institute in Amiens. When the medical examiner completed his examination, the pieces of this bizarre puzzle finally started to fall into place, revealing a sequence of physical events that was almost too tragic to believe. The autopsy of 69-year-old Lucien Perau revealed that his lungs were completely clear of any fluid or disease, but his trachea was entirely blocked. A large piece of tough grilled beef rib, measuring nearly 3 inches in length, was wedged tightly in his throat. Lucien had tried to swallow this massive piece of meat without chewing it. The pathologist noted that Lucien was missing almost all of his molars, which are the teeth responsible for grinding down tough food like meat. Because he lacked these teeth, and because he was eating quickly, he had swallowed the chunk of beef whole. It had immediately blocked his airway, preventing him from breathing or making any sound. He was experiencing acute asphyxiation, a terrifying state where the brain is rapidly starved of oxygen. Next, the medical examiner performed the autopsy on 38-year-old Olivier Boudin. Unlike Lucien, Olivier's airway was completely clear, and there was no food in his trachea. However, his heart showed signs of a massive acute myocardial infarction. Olivier had a congenital heart condition known as cardiomegaly, which is a pathological enlargement of the heart muscle. While people with this condition can live relatively normal lives with proper medication and monitoring, their hearts are extremely vulnerable to sudden, massive spikes in blood pressure and adrenaline, and so the reconstruction of their final moments became painfully clear. Lucien and Olivier were sitting at the table, enjoying their dinner and the music playing from the radio. Lucien took a large bite of the beef rib, failed to chew it properly due to his missing teeth, and attempted to swallow it. The meat became lodged in his throat, and he began to choke violently, clutching his chest and throat, his face turning blue as he struggled for air. Olivier, sitting directly across from him, saw his best friend and father figure suddenly suffocating and thrashing in his chair. Olivier was instantly seized with an overwhelming wave of panic and terror. The sudden shock of seeing his friend dying caused a massive instantaneous release of adrenaline into Olivier's bloodstream. His heart rate skyrocketed and his blood pressure surged. For a normal, healthy heart, this would have been a standard fight-or-flight response. But for Olivier's enlarged and fragile heart, it was a lethal blow. The cardiac muscle simply could not handle the sudden, violent surge of pressure. His heart went into ventricular fibrillation and seized up completely. Olivier suffered a massive heart attack, collapsed backward onto the grass, and died within seconds. Lucien, who was still desperately struggling to dislodge the meat from his throat, was now left completely alone. He had watched his younger friend suddenly collapse onto the ground, unable to help him. Lucien had no way to perform the Heimlich maneuver on himself, and without anyone there to assist him or call for help, he simply sat in his chair, losing consciousness as his brain was starved of oxygen until he finally passed away. Fast forward to the next morning, when their neighbor Marie looked out her second-floor window. She saw Lucien sitting at the table and Olivier lying on the grass, and she assumed they had just had a long night of heavy drinking and were sleeping it off. It was only hours later, when the hot midday sun failed to wake them, that she realized the horrifying truth. The two best friends, who had found such comfort and companionship in each other's company, had been taken away in a matter of minutes by a cruel physical chain reaction of events. Now, when we look at the mystery of the Kaz-2, the details of the investigation are even more baffling. The 35-foot catamaran was designed and built to be one of the safest, most stable vessels on the water. Catamarans have twin hulls, which makes them incredibly resistant to tipping over, even in rough seas. The vessel was equipped with state-of-the-art navigation systems, life jackets, an emergency position indicating radio beacon, and a fully functional marine radio. When the rescue officer, Corey Benson, boarded the boat on April 20th, he was stepping onto a vessel that was fully operational. The boat's GPS was still active, and when investigators analyzed the recorded data, they were able to reconstruct the exact path the Kaz-2 had taken since its departure from Airlie Beach on April 15th. The GPS data showed that the boat had traveled along the planned coastal route for the first few hours of the trip, just as Jim's video had shown. But then, around 2 p.m. on April 15th, the GPS recorded a sudden, sharp 90-degree turn to the northeast. The boat began sailing directly away from the coast out into the deep, open waters of the Coral Sea. This turn was made at a speed of about 6 knots, and the boat maintained this heading for several miles. But the problem was, there was absolutely no reason for the crew to make this turn. Des Batten was a highly experienced sailor who was deeply familiar with the dangers of the open ocean, and he had been adamant about staying close to the shore. Furthermore, the GPS showed that after sailing out into the open water for several hours, the boat made another series of turns, eventually doubling back and returning to the vicinity of Champagne Bay on April 16th. This matched perfectly with the testimonies of the witnesses. Isabel Wheeler had seen the boat make that sharp turn on April 15th, and the two other witnesses had seen it sailing in circles in the exact same area on April 16th. But why would 3 experienced sailors spend 24 hours sailing in circles, violating their own safety rules without ever radioing for help or using their satellite phone? And then there was the sighting by the fishermen on April 17th. They saw the boat navigating through a highly dangerous coral reef system. The sails were torn to shreds, indicating that the boat had been battered by strong winds or had been improperly handled. Yet, the fishermen were certain that they saw a man standing at the helm, calmly steering the boat through the reefs. The pilot looked completely in control, steering the vessel around the shallow obstacles with expert precision. This was confirmed again on April 18th by the crew of the Coast Watch helicopter. They also saw the boat with its damaged sails, and they also saw a figure at the helm steering the boat through the treacherous waters. They tried to make contact over the radio, but they received no response. At this point, the investigators were faced with a massive contradiction. If the 3 men had fallen overboard and drowned on the very first day of the trip, as the official coroner's inquest would later suggest, then who was the person steering the boat on April 16th, 17th, and 18th? Who was the pilot who navigated the vessel through miles of dangerous shallow coral reefs with tattered sails without ever responding to radio calls or setting off the emergency beacon? When Corey Benson boarded the boat on April 20th, he found that the engine was still running, idling quietly in neutral. The GPS was on, and there was a cold but half-filled mug of coffee sitting on the table. A t-shirt was neatly folded on a chair with a pair of reading glasses resting on top of it. In the cabin, there were plates of food set out on the counter, and a laptop computer was open and running. All of the men's wallets, cash, passports, and life jackets were sitting in their lockers completely untouched. The official coroner's theory was that one of the men had gone to the transom of the boat to try and free a tangled fishing line or retrieve a dropped item. He had lost his balance and fallen into the water. The second man, seeing his friend in the water, had rushed to help him, but had also fallen overboard. The third man, panic-stricken, would have tried to steer the boat back to save them, but in his haste, he too fell into the water, leaving the catamaran to drift away on its own, while the three men tragically drowned in the ocean. But this theory simply could not explain the physical evidence. If the men had all fallen overboard on April 15th, then who was the person seen steering the boat for the next 3 days? How did the boat navigate through miles of dangerous coral reefs without crashing if there was no one on board? And why was the engine still running and the coffee still sitting on the table 5 days later? If the boat had been drifting unmanned for 5 days, the engine would have run out of fuel, and the coffee would have evaporated or been knocked over by the movement of the waves. The families of Des, Jim, and Peter were left with a haunting, unresolved mystery. They had watched their loved ones set off on a dream vacation, completely happy and healthy, only for their boat to be found completely empty just a few days later, with all of their belongings untouched. Despite an extensive search and a detailed investigation, no trace of the three men was ever found, and their disappearance remains one of the most baffling maritime mysteries in modern history. Each of these three cases leaves us with a profound sense of unease. They remind us that the world is full of strange, unpredictable forces, and that sometimes the line between the living and the dead, the past and the present, is far more fragile than we would ever like to admit. Whether it is a ghost car reenacting a tragic crash from 5 months in the past, a freak physical chain reaction that takes the lives of two best friends in a matter of minutes, or a perfectly functional catamaran floating empty in the vast ocean with its engine still running, these stories show us that the truth is often far stranger than any fiction we could ever write. When we think about Christopher Brian Chandler, we are left with the image of a young man who spent his final months hiding from the world, only for his resting place to be revealed by a mysterious event that defies physical explanation. His family was able to finally lay him to rest, but the question of who was driving that car on December 11th will never be answered. For Lucien Perrault and Olivier Boudin, their lives were defined by a deep, unlikely friendship that brought warmth and meaning to their final years. Their sudden, simultaneous deaths were not the result of a violent crime or a malicious act, but rather a tragic physical coincidence that joined them in death just as they had been joined in life. And for the families of Des Batten, Jim Tunstead, and Peter Tunstead, the ocean remains a vast, silent vault that holds the secret of their loved ones' final moments. The Caz-2 continues to drift in the memories of those who knew them, a beautiful white catamaran sailing forever into the unknown, leaving behind only tattered sails and unanswered questions. The investigations have long since closed, the official reports have been filed away in dusty archives, and the locations where these events took place have returned to their quiet, normal routines. The A3 highway is still crowded, with daily commuters driving past the trees where Christopher's car once sat. The small village in northern France still enjoys its quiet summer evenings, though the patio next to Marie's window remains empty. And the beautiful blue waters off the coast of Australia still draw sailors and fishermen from all over the world who look out over the horizon and wonder what truly happened to the crew of the Caz-2. These cases remind us of the fragility of our everyday lives. We plan our journeys, we gather with our friends, we set sail on our adventures, completely unaware of the invisible threads of fate that are constantly moving around us. And when those threads collide, they can create mysteries that will haunt us for generations, leaving us to search the dark woods, the silent backyards, and the vast open seas for answers that may never come. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. An individual by the name of Luther Charles was seated on the weathered wooden steps of his parents' front porch in St. Louis, Missouri, on a weekday morning in the month of March in the year 1995. Despite the fact that the air was cool and sharp, Luther did not detect it. His full attention was zeroed in on the newspaper that was spread out across his lap. It had been several hours since his parents had left for work, and the sound of their vehicles rolling out of the driveway was a familiar and rhythmic departure that signaled the beginning of yet another day that he would spend at home. Luther was unable to find work. 5 years had passed since he had last had a steady employment. It wasn't because he was a slacker, rather, it was because he had a simple, all-encompassing dream. Luther had a dream of becoming an actress. During the course of a half-decade, he had committed every ounce of his existence to the pursuit of this goal. Rather than only daydreaming about it, he was actively working toward achieving it. Until his own face seemed like it belonged to a stranger, he went to every audition he could find, studied monologues while he was in the shower, and practiced facial expressions in the mirror of the bathroom. On the other hand, the reality was a cruel cycle of hope followed by rejection that kept repeating itself. He would enter a casting room with his pulse hammering, perform his lines with everything he had, and then receive a courteous but forceful, "Thank you, we'll let you know." However, they never did let him know. 5 years of this had left him absolutely bankrupt, and he was still living in the bedroom he had used as a child at his parents' house. He was a grown man who was still dependent on the generosity of his parents. However, the dream itself had not diminished in any way, despite the ongoing series of setbacks. When all else was considered, it had gotten more intense and more urgent. He was aware of what his peers believed. He could hear it in the way his relatives would ask, "So, any luck with that acting thing?" He knew they saw it as a childish fantasy, a pipe dream. They were of the opinion that he ought to be practical, acquire a regular job that required him to work from 9 to 5, and acknowledge that there are certain things that simply aren't meant to be. On the other hand, Luther could not even fathom such a possibility. At that moment, the thought of abandoning up felt like a form of death. Either it was acting, or there was nothing at all. Consequently, he found himself back on this porch each and every morning, performing the same actions for the same reason. As he went through the classified section of the newspaper, he would slowly flip through it, his eyes searching for the words that would change everything: open call or auditions. While he was walking down a column of very small type on this particular morning, his gaze was drawn to something that caught his interest. It was a commercial that did not appear to be proper. The production of the musical was taking place in Ohio, which was several hundred miles away from where it was being used. From the beginning, Luther was only perplexed. There was no need for a theater company in Ohio to advertise for performers in a newspaper in St. Louis when they are located in Indiana. It was very confusing to me. As he read the text in further detail, however, he felt a surge of electricity go through his physique. In the advertisement, it was said that the producers were looking for a very specific type of actor to play a character that was described as being highly different and difficult to play. It was not an error. Rather, the advertisement was a targeted search. Additionally, as Luther read the particular criterion, he experienced a peculiar feeling of assurance that washed over him. There was more to him than merely a wonderful fit for this role. He embodied the ideal candidate. He was thinking that this might be the final solution. It's possible that this will be for him. However, he was well aware that this would not be a simple task. It was a very difficult challenge. To begin, there was the great distance between them. It was that exact night that the audition was scheduled, which meant that he would have to abandon everything, hop into his car, and drive for the entire day in order to have a brief opportunity to perform on a stage in Ohio. This brings us to the second and most significant point: the character themselves. If he wanted to provide a performance that the producers would never forget, he would have to do something drastic in order to properly embrace this part on the big screen. Considering the level of dedication that would be required, the majority of actors would not even contemplate it. Luther, however, was not like other actors. Once he had been informed that he was not good enough for 5 years, he was determined to do everything in order to prove his point. Desperation had been building up for such a long time that it had now reached a point where it had boiled over into a kind of reckless determination. Despite the fact that he was still holding the newspaper tightly in his hand, He got up from the porch and made his way back into the home. He then proceeded to stroll out to his vehicle a few minutes later. Over the course of his lengthy voyage, he was transporting 3 items with him. When he arrived at the theater in Ohio, he was accompanied by a map. In order to give him the bravery he would require, he had a whole bottle of whiskey in his possession. In addition to that, he was armed with a hacksaw to assist him in his role. During that particular evening in Ohio, a producer for the musical was seen sitting in a seat that was facing the front row of an auditorium that was otherwise empty. There were long shadows cast all across the room by the stage lights. She was really worn out. There had been a procession of hopeful actors coming and going for a number of hours, each one attempting to impress her by reading monologues, singing songs, and performing. In spite of the fact that she was aware that there was still a queue of people waiting outside in the corridor, she moaned and rubbed her temples. For the next person to enter, she yelled out for them to do so. Just a few moments later, a man made his way onto the stage by stumbling through the side curtain. The expression on the producer's face changed from one of exhaustion to one of confusion as she sat up a bit upright. As if he were intoxicated, the man was wobbly on his feet and swayed slightly from side to side. Additionally, he was dressed in a peculiar attire. He had thick, white bandages wrapped securely over his head, covering his ears and the most of his face. Both of his ears were covered. In a slurred and thick voice, he proclaimed that his name was Luther Charles. He staggered to the center of the platform, blinked into the lights, and then announced his name. He claimed that he had traveled all the way from Missouri to be considered for the role because he was aware that they were searching for a very certain type of actor, and he had made certain that he was an ideal candidate for the role. The producer was completely clueless about the subject he was discussing. She tried to urge him to clarify, to explain what he meant, but before she could get the words out, Luther began to lift his hands up to his head. She found herself unable to finish her sentence. Unwrapping the bandages was something he did in a methodical and slow manner. He yanked at the white gauze, allowing it to fall onto the stage floor in a jumbled mass due to his actions. As she watched, the producer felt a mounting sense of dread building up in her gut. It was only when the final bandage was removed, exposing the contents of the wound, that she was able to see it. Moreover, she started yelling for assistance. It would come out that the casting call that had been published in the newspaper, the one that had given Luther Charles such a powerful sense of hope, contained an error that was extremely terrible and devastating. Those who were in charge of producing the musical were looking for actors who were not just honest, but also courageous. But the advertisement that had been published in the newspaper in St. Louis contained a call for, quote, genuine earless actors. Luther Charles, who had been so consumed by his desire and so broken by 5 years of rejection, had come to the conclusion that this was his one and only chance. After driving all the way to Ohio, he had consumed a whole bottle of whiskey in an attempt to dull the pain. After that, he had committed a heinous act of self-mutilation by cutting off both of his own ears with a hacksaw. He was convinced that by making this sacrifice, he would be able to fulfill the role perfectly. Luther made it through the injuries he inflicted on himself. He received significant psychological care after being brought to the hospital, where he remained for some time. Nevertheless, he was not selected for the role. In the evening of October 2003, a woman named Tina was walking down the lengthy and narrow hallway of her apartment building in Harlem, New York. She was in the process of making her way down the corridor. While walking cautiously on the worn linoleum floor, she carried a grocery bag in one hand and moved with some caution. The walls were covered in pristine white tile, and the huge metal doors of the flats stood like sentinels on either side of the walls. The corridor was illuminated with a peculiar, pulsating glow as the fluorescent lights that were hanging above flickered in an irregular manner. Tina was confronted with a fragrance that was both recognizable and repulsive as she came to a stop in front of her own door, which resided in apartment 5D. It was coming from apartment 5E, which was right across the hall from where it arrived. It had a heavy, smelly odor that was a combination of rotting flesh and pee that had been around for a long time. Tina's expression changed to one of disdain. The only thing she wanted more than anything was to get inside her own apartment and get away from the odor. She hastily put her grocery bag down and began searching through her purse for her keys. The sound of footfall approaching from down the corridor came to her attention just as her fingers were about to close over the cool metal of her keys. As soon as she turned around, a surge of worry swept through her. Antoine Yates, the individual who resided in apartment 5E, was the person responsible for the foul odor, as it was known. As he approached her, he was carrying a large bag that appeared to be quite heavy over his shoulder. He was going directly toward her. On the surface, it appeared as though it might be filled with sand or possibly gravel. It was something that Tina had no idea what it was, and she had no desire to find out. Simply put, she was aware that she did not wish to be in any way close to him. The door was thrown open by her clumsy hands as she smashed her key into the lock, turned it, and then threw it open. To the point that she virtually dove inside, she grabbed her grocery bag from the floor, slammed the door shut behind her, and instantly threw the deadbolt. Because she had been so plainly impolite, she felt a rush of shame wash over her. Finally, Antoine had been her neighbor for a considerable amount of time. A period of time had passed when she had the impression that he was a completely decent and typical guy. However, as of late, he has undergone a shift in some aspect. He had developed an odd and peculiar demeanor, and his actions were causing her to feel extremely uneasy. The odor, which appeared to emanate from his apartment at all hours of the day and night, was the initial cause of the problem. Another factor to consider was the fact that he had turned into a complete recluse. Tina was unable to recall the last time she had saw him leave the premises for a period of time that was more than an hour all at once. There was a steady, unseen presence just a few feet away from her own front door, and it was as if he was holed up in there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. On the other hand, the noise was the most unnerving aspect. Tina would hear heavy crashing and thumping sounds coming from Antoine's flat at irregular intervals, whether it was during the day or the night. The sound was similar to that of furniture being thrown around, but as far as she could tell, he never had any guests inside his home. There was only him inside the room. Despite the fact that Tina was unaware of what he was doing, she was beginning to get the impression that whatever it was not a nice thing. Despite this, she assured herself that it was none of her business. All she could do was keep to herself, make sure that her door was always locked, and keep her fingers crossed that whatever bizarre phase Antoine was going through would ultimately pass. This was the best thing she could do. Following a couple of days, Tina made her way down to the lobby in order to retrieve her mail. During the process of organizing her letters, she came across a woman named Joyce. Joyce was a resident of apartment 4E, which was the flat that was just below Antoine's. After a brief greeting, Joyce approached Tina with a worried expression on her face and walked over to her. Tina had the ability to sense that something was awry, so she inquired about the situation. In her explanation, Joyce mentioned that she had observed liquid dripping from her ceiling the night before yesterday. Her initial assumption was that it was nothing more than a leaking pipe or even a sink from the apartment above that was overflowing. On the other hand, she discovered that it was not water when she brought a cloth to wipe it up. A powerful and pungent odor emanated from the liquid. A scent of urine was present. Joyce then softened her voice and moved closer to Tina, bringing her closer to her. She stated that the pouring was not the only peculiar thing that occurred. She went on to say that she was able to hear sounds emanating from Antoine's flat on occasion, particularly in the late hours of the night when the building was entirely silent. Not a single crash or bang could be heard. It was almost like a whimpering sound. As soon as she heard that, Tina's heart began to race. She had exerted a great deal of effort to disregard the circumstance and to simply blank it out. However, now that she was aware that another neighbor was also going through strange and unsettling occurrences, she felt as though she could no longer maintain her silence. Something more than simply an odd odor was going on here. Tina made a suggestion to Joyce that they should initiate a call to the housing authority in order to have someone come out and investigate the situation that was occurring in apartment 5E. For her part, Joyce simply shook her head. She stated that she had already attempted that at least a few times. Despite the fact that she had contacted and voiced her displeasure, there had been no action taken as of yet. A new strategy was then suggested by Tina. It is recommended that they get together with all of the other neighbors who are worried and go to the housing authority as a group. It would be impossible to disregard the complaints of a significant number of tenants, wouldn't it? I concur with Joyce that it was a good idea. Following the exchange of phone numbers between the two women, Tina made her way back to her flat, feeling a little more optimistic about the situation. The very following day, however, Tina arrived into the lobby of her building and was greeted with a scene of commotion. This occurred before she had the opportunity to speak with anyone else during the day. Unable to contain his misery, Antoine was lying on the ground. In an effort to maintain control of the situation, 2 law enforcement personnel were crouching over him. Blood was spread all over the tile floor, and Antoine had inflicted significant cuts on both his arm and his leg. The wounds were gaping and deep. Tina halted for a while, unsure about what to do, and then swiftly hurried away from the scene, indicating that she did not wish to become involved. Upstairs, she hurriedly went to her apartment and locked the door behind her. However, she was unable to contain her interest. She made a beeline for her window, which looked out onto the street, in the hopes of gaining some insight into the unexpected events that had just taken place. I watched an ambulance pull up to the curb, and she noticed it. There were a few moments later when paramedics exited from the building while pushing a stretcher that included Antoine on it. They loaded him into the back of the ambulance, and then their sirens began to sound as they rushed away. Tina watched, hoping that she would hear the police officers coming down her corridor to smash down the door of apartment 5E at any moment. She was awaiting them with great anticipation. Clearly, a violent incident had taken place, and the flat in question had to be the location of the perpetrator. She, however, waited. She waited for an hour, but she did not hear anything. The corridor remained devoid of sound. Then she peeked out her window once more and observed the 2 police officers who were stationed in the lobby walk out of the building, get into their squad vehicle, and then simply drive away. It was a shock to Tina. She was unable to comprehend all of it. There is no way that Antoine could have ever told them something that would have caused them to depart without even checking out his place. A growing sense of panic began to envelop her. What would happen if someone was harmed inside then? Imagine for a moment that Antoine had been assaulting someone and that they had finally started fighting back. Regardless of what was taking place, it was made abundantly obvious that it would never cease unless another individual raised their voice. She was aware of what she needed to do, despite the fact that it terrified her. She obtained her phone, contacted 911, and provided the dispatcher with all of the information that she was aware of regarding her neighbor who lived in Unit 5E. Tina arrived home from work the following day to discover a large crowd assembled on the pavement in front of her building. There were hundreds of people standing there, and each and every one of them was looking up at the opposite side of the structure. Tina's jaw fell as she followed their eyes and looked at them. From the roof of the building, a law enforcement officer was rappelling down the side of the structure. As he stood there, he was armed with a huge weapon and dressed in combat gear. He went slowly and cautiously, making his way down until he came to a stop, hung in the air right outside a window on the 5th level. Tina was taken aback when she became aware that he was standing at Antoine's window. The gathering remained silent as the officer began to tap on the glass, and they watched in reverent curiosity. Instantaneously, the window shattered outwards, causing pieces of glass to fall down onto the street below. Internally, it had been shattered into pieces. Instantaneously, the cop raised his firearm and fired a number of shots into the flat. Concurrently, he gave a signal to the officers who were stationed on the roof, and they immediately started dragging him up and away from the window. After a few minutes had passed, the front doors of the building suddenly opened, and a half-dozen additional officers came sprinting out of the building. It was a massive and heavy tarp that they were carrying between them, and whatever was contained within it was an enormous and struggling object. Tina was very perplexed by everything that was going on until the officers passed the tarp by her. Only for a fraction of a second did she get a peek of what was contained within. It would come out that Tina and Joyce were correct in their suspicions of Antoine. Nevertheless, the reality was much more peculiar than they could have ever imagined it to be. It is not true that Antoine was a violent criminal who caused harm to individuals in his residence. Despite the fact that he was concealing a secret, it was a rather peculiar one. He had a pet of his own, a Bengal tiger named Ming that weighs 400 pounds. For a considerable amount of time, the tiger had been residing within that modest apartment in Harlem. A massive heap of sand served as its bed in one of the bedrooms of the house. It urinated all over the flat, which resulted in the odor and the leaking that Joyce had observed. Antoine also provided it with a food consisting of raw meat, which he would bring back to his house in those enormous sacks. The terrible wounds that Antoine sustained and that required him to go to the hospital were caused by Ming. It had just lately come to Antoine's attention that he had taken in a stray kitten. When the tiger attempted to attack on the much smaller cat, Antoine had intervened and ended up getting bitten in the process. It was Antoine and Ming who made it through the confrontation alive. After being taken into custody, Antoine was found guilty of reckless endangerment. After the officer on the rope had administered a tranquilizer dart to Ming, he was hauled out of the premises and subsequently transported to an animal refuge in Ohio. Ming had been hit with the dart. Furthermore, it is remarkable that the stray kitten managed to survive the attack as well. On the 6th of January, 1995, at 2:45 in the afternoon, a man called MacArthur Wheeler, who was 45 years old at the time, proceeded with intent toward the glass front doors of a bank located in Swissvale, Pennsylvania, which is a tiny town located just outside of Pittsburgh. In spite of the fact that the temperature was rather mild, he was dressed in a large blue parka and wore a simple mask that was pulled over his face. However, the mask did not completely cover his entire face. Although it was concealed within one of his pockets, his hand was resting on the icy steel of a revolver that was semi-automatic. It was about to be MacArthur's turn to rob this bank. On the other hand, there was a peculiar sense of peace that he experienced as he approached the door. Not in the least bit anxious was he. It came as a surprise to everyone, especially considering that MacArthur had never done anything remotely like to this in his entire life. But he was not by himself. The individual that was already inside was his acquaintance, a man named Clifton Johnson, who was 43 years old. Clifton had participated in a bank robbery in the past, and he was the one who had recruited MacArthur to participate in this scheme. At this very moment, Clifton was waiting in line, acting as if he were just another client. However, in reality, he was acting as MacArthur's sidekick and lookout. In order to carry out this heist, the two men had spent several days carefully arranging every aspect of it. They were familiar with the layout of the bank, had timed the flow of customers, and had practiced each and every move they were going to make. Clifton exuded an air of serenity and self-assurance, in contrast to MacArthur, who had initially been filled with fear at the prospect. MacArthur had been taken through every conceivable scenario that could have gone wrong, and he had devised a backup plan for each and every one of each of those scenarios. The self-assurance that Clifton exuded had already made its way into MacArthur by the time this day arrived. At this point, he was very positive that their strategy was devoid of any possibility of failure and that they were going to be able to get away with it. For this reason, he did not feel anxious. Upon approaching the doors of the bank, he forced them open and proceeded to enter the establishment. Although he had to squint a little bit since his mask hindered his eyesight a little bit, he was able to locate Clifton standing in line very quickly, which was exactly what they had planned. Another boost of self-assurance came to MacArthur when he observed him in that location. Without a hitch, everything was operating. As he strolled past the queue of clients who were waiting, he went straight to the teller window that was open and made eye contact with the young woman who was working behind the counter. The revolver was pulled out of his pocket while he continued to do so. He gently instructed her to pay up all of the money while directing it directly at her to be handed over. The other individuals in the bank let out a collective gasp, which he heard them all say. As soon as they had a glimpse of what was taking place, customers and other personnel were rendered speechless, their eyes widened in terror. After a moment, MacArthur turned around and raised the rifle so that everyone could see it. He assured them that he had no intention of causing harm to anyone. Just to be calm, that was all he asked of them. As soon as he obtained the funds, he would go without a trace. Next, he refocused his attention on the teller. By this point, she had quickly retrieved all of the cash from her drawer and was in the process of holding it out with a hand that was shaking. The bundle of cash was taken by MacArthur, who then placed it into his pocket and put his revolver away somewhere else. He cast a quick glance in the direction of Clifton, who was on his way to the entrance. Both males established eye contact with one another and gave each other a slight nod. The two of them then made a U-turn and fled the bank, disappearing down the street immediately after. Roughly 3 months had passed on. The early morning hours of the 20th of April, 1995, saw MacArthur sound asleep in his apartment located just outside of Pittsburgh. He had been there for quite some time. He and Clifton had taken their booty, which was a little more than $5,000, and had promptly gone their separate ways after the robbery had been completed. The goal was to keep a low profile, stop making touch with one another, and wait for things to calm down. Everything had gone according to plan as far as MacArthur was concerned, and everything had worked out perfectly. Even though 3 months had passed, he was still a free man, and he was enjoying his portion of the money that had been taken. He had never been approached by the police, nor had they ever attempted to question him in any way. There was no danger to him. On the other hand, on this particular night, his restful sleep was disrupted by a loud and persistent beating on his front door. While he was lying in bed, he suddenly became upright as a voice called for him to open his eyes and announced that it was the cops. A surge of genuine panic came over MacArthur for the very first time since the heist had taken place. Nevertheless, he promptly made an effort to settle himself down. The advice he gave himself was to just keep his cool. Even in the event that the police believed he was involved in some manner, there was no way that they could prove anything. Their plan had been flawless all along. A mask and a massive parka that totally covered him had been worn by him at the time. His identity was safely protected. After that, MacArthur got out of bed, strolled to the door, and opened it. He took a deep breath before doing so. In the corridor, there were a number of law enforcement officers standing. The question was posed by MacArthur, who put on his most bewildered appearance and inquired about the situation. When he was notified that he was being arrested for armed robbery, one of the cops informed him of the situation. The officer then displayed a photograph to the public. The image was a still one, and it had been printed from one of the security cameras at the bank. And MacArthur's face was seen in the photograph, as plain as the sun. It was possible to make out every nuance of his appearance, from his eyes to his nose to his mouth. It could not have been anyone else but him. In point of fact, it did not appear in any way that he was wearing a mask throughout the entire photo. Despite his mind's inability to comprehend what he was seeing, MacArthur continued to stare at the photograph. This was not to be expected. His expression was a mixture of amazement and bewilderment as he looked up from the photo to the faces of the cops serving the law. Afterwards, he uttered a remark that would leave the police absolutely perplexed when they heard it. "Just now," he articulated, "but I wore the juice." In the course of the bank heist, it would be discovered that the mask that MacArthur Wheeler was wearing was not a ski mask, a Halloween mask, or any other form of mask in the conventional sense. What can only be characterized as a breathtaking leap of erroneous logic, MacArthur and his accomplice Clifton had come to believe that they had discovered a hidden way to turn invisible. This is something that can only be described as outrageous. The thing that they had done and what they sincerely believed would fully conceal their identity from the surveillance cameras was to put lemon juice all over their faces. As a matter of fact, they were under the notion that the acidic juice would function as a kind of invisibility cloak, rendering their faces hazy or completely invisible to electronic surveillance. Lemon juice does not, contrary to what they believe, possess the ability to render you invisible. Upon reviewing the CCTV footage of the bank, the police were presented with a high-definition, crystal-clear view of MacArthur Wheeler and Clifton Johnson committing the theft of the bank. The fact that there was such abundant evidence meant that it was just a matter of time before they were recognized and taken into custody. The role that Clifton Johnson played in the armed robbery resulted in him receiving a sentence of 5 years in jail. MacArthur Wheeler was given a sentence that was significantly more severe, which was 22.5 years. On the other hand, this odd and almost comical crime did not completely end there. In the end, a professor of social psychology at Cornell University became interested in the story of the lemon juice bandits when it was reported in the media and eventually drew his attention. After reading about the case, the professor was struck by something that had a deep impact on him. A level of stupidity that was almost impossible to grasp was suggested by the fact that MacArthur Wheeler sincerely believed that lemon juice would render him invisible, and that he was so certain of this view that he used it as a basis for betting his freedom on it. Even more remarkable, however, was MacArthur's reaction of surprise when he was discovered. The fact that he was confused gave the impression that he was not only incompetent, but that he was also totally oblivious to the fact that he was failing. The professor's interest was piqued by this thought, and he accordingly started conducting research on the topic. This research finally resulted in the development of a well-known psychological theory that is now commonly referred to as the Dunning-Kruger effect. In essence, the effect argues that individuals who have a low capacity to perform a task have a tendency to exaggerate their own abilities. In more straightforward terms, the more terrible a person is at something, the less likely it is that they will acknowledge how incompetent they are at that particular item. At the end of the day, it's true that the more ignorant you are, the more self-assured you become. You are very much appreciated for watching. If you watched today's program, please share your thoughts with me in the comments section. You should also keep in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of true crime ready for you to watch in one sitting right now. Up until the next time, what's up?